Imagine stepping outside on a bitterly cold winter day, only to find the world around you has been entirely transformed into a swirling, white abyss. The howling wind sounds almost like a living thing, screaming through the trees and burying streets under mountains of snow. It's in these moments of nature's raw power that we're reminded just how fragile our sense of control can be, and how extraordinary the stories hidden within these storms truly are. Across American history, blizzards have not only disrupted lives but also carved out legends, leaving behind tales of survival, mystery, and moments that defy all logic. Today, we're delving into some of the most bizarre and extreme winter events to ever sweep across this nation. We'll explore storms that brought cities to a standstill, events where snow fell in colors no one could explain, and tempests that seemed to rewrite the rules of weather itself. These aren't just stories of snowfall and cold, they're windows into moments when nature decided to show its strangest, most unpredictable face. From the infamous blizzard of 1888 that paralyzed the East Coast to far lesser-known tempests that brought with them oddities which left meteorologists scratching their heads, each of these events has a story that stands the test of time. You're about to journey through 29 of the strangest blizzards in American history, each one more captivating than the last. We'll uncover how communities faced these incredible challenges, the eerie phenomena accompanying some of these storms, and what these events reveal about our relationship with the natural world. So settle in and prepare to be amazed, because what you're about to discover goes far beyond ordinary winter weather. It's a tour through the moments when snow and ice wrote some of the most unforgettable chapters in the story of America. No one was prepared for what arrived in March of 1888. The weather leading into that month had been unseasonably mild, with some areas even reporting early spring flowers beginning to bloom. This sense of calm was a profound deception. On the 11th of March, two powerful weather systems did the unthinkable. They collided. A mass of cold Arctic air from Canada slammed directly into a moisture-laden system from the Atlantic Ocean. The result was a meteorological monster, a hurricane of snow that would etch its name into history with a brutality few could have imagined. The storm's statistics are still staggering to comprehend today. Over the course of 36 relentless hours, cities across the Northeast were buried. New York City was smothered under 21 inches of snow, while parts of Connecticut and Massachusetts saw accumulations climb to an unimaginable 50 inches. But the snow itself was only part of the story. It was the hurricane-force winds gusting up to 80 miles per hour that transformed the landscape into a deadly, shifting maze. These winds sculpted the deep snow into drifts that reached phenomenal heights, some recorded at over 50 feet taller than a four-story building. These weren't just piles of snow, they were veritable mountains that swallowed houses, buried train cars, and completely erased streets from the map. The paralysis was instantaneous and absolute. Above ground, the entire transportation network vanished. Trains, the lifeblood of the economy and society, were stopped dead in their tracks, with snow entombing the locomotives and their passengers. Some people were stranded in these icy tombs for days, forced to burn the train's wooden seats and fittings for warmth as food supplies dwindled. The elevated rail lines in New York City became frozen galleries of stranded commuter cars, while on the streets, every single horse-drawn streetcar was abandoned, creating a ghostly scene of hundreds of vehicles peeking out from the deep drifts. Telegraph and telephone lines, the nascent internet of its day, were the first systems to fail. With poles snapped by the weight of ice and snow, communication between cities was completely severed, leaving communities isolated and utterly alone to face the storm's fury. The human cost was devastating, with an estimated 400 lives lost. Many perished in heartbreaking attempts to simply go home, becoming disoriented and freezing to death just feet from their own doors. The stories from that week are a harrowing tapestry of survival and tragedy. There are accounts of hotel lobbies in New York becoming impromptu shelters, packed with hundreds of strangers who shared food and huddled together for warmth, creating fleeting communities bound by shared adversity. Yet, for every story of survival, there was one of profound loss, like that of Senator Roscoe Conkling, who famously refused to pay for a carriage ride during the storm and attempted to walk home from his office in New York. The arduous trek through the deep snow and blinding wind proved too much for him. He collapsed and died several weeks later from pneumonia brought on by the exhausting ordeal. The Great Blizzard of 1888 was more than a storm. It was a national trauma that exposed the fragility of human systems in the face of nature's absolute power. In the stunned silence that followed the storm's departure, a powerful determination took root. The sheer scale of the devastation made one thing undeniably clear: the nation's growing cities were woefully unprepared for such an assault by nature, and a catastrophe of this magnitude could not be allowed to happen again. This collective resolve transformed the trauma of the Great White Hurricane into a powerful catalyst for innovation, fundamentally reshaping the American urban landscape in ways we still benefit from today. Perhaps the most immediate and visible change was the swift burial of the webs of wires that had once cluttered the skies above city streets. The complete collapse of telegraph communication had been a primary factor in the chaos, leaving officials unable to coordinate rescue efforts and families unable to confirm the safety of loved ones. In direct response, cities like New York and Boston launched ambitious public works projects to place all telegraph, telephone, and electrical lines securely underground. This monumental effort not only protected vital communication links from future storms but also cleared the aerial clutter, giving birth to the clean, wire-free skylines we now associate with modern metropolises. The transportation nightmare also sparked a revolution in how people moved through dense urban centers. With trains buried and horse-drawn vehicles rendered utterly useless, city planners were forced to conceive of a system that could operate entirely independent of surface weather. This pressing need became the single greatest impetus for the development of the first subway systems in the United States. Just over a decade after the blizzard, in 1904, New York City opened its first underground subway line, providing a reliable, all-weather alternative that would forever change the rhythm of city life and become the backbone of urban transit. Beyond bricks and mortar, the storm forged a new philosophy of civic preparedness. The brutal lessons learned about isolation and the breakdown of essential services led to the creation of the first formalized urban emergency response plans. Cities began stockpiling snow removal equipment, salt, and emergency supplies for the first time in history. Weather forecasting, then in its infancy, received increased funding and attention as the government recognized the life-saving value of advanced warning. The United States Weather Bureau itself was reorganized and strengthened in the blizzard's wake, tasked with providing more accurate and timely forecasts to prevent such a surprise from ever happening again. The Great Blizzard of 1888 was a tragedy of immense proportion, but its legacy is etched into the very infrastructure of our cities, a permanent reminder that from the deepest snowdrifts, progress can indeed emerge. Just 11 months after the Great White Hurricane paralyzed the East Coast, a very different kind of blizzard was brewing over the American heartland. This storm would earn a chillingly specific nickname, one that speaks directly to the heart of its tragedy: the Schoolhouse Blizzard. The cruelest irony of this event was the weather on the morning of January 12, 1888. Across the Dakota and Nebraska territories, as well as parts of Minnesota, Iowa, and Kansas, the day dawned unseasonably and deceptively warm. After a long stretch of bitter cold, the sudden thaw felt like a gift. Children left for school wearing light jackets or even no coats at all, and farmers used the opportunity to tend to livestock far from their homesteads, confident the mild conditions would hold. The catastrophe began not with falling snow, but with a phenomenon known as a flash freeze, a massive mass of Arctic air, some of the coldest ever recorded, came screaming down from Canada at an astonishing speed. Temperatures plummeted, dropping nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit in some places in just 24 hours. In Rapid City, the mercury fell from 55 degrees above zero to 45 degrees below in a single day. This crash was accompanied by hurricane-force winds that instantly picked up the existing light snow from the prairies, grinding it into a blinding, suffocating sheet of white. There was no heavy snowfall to warn people. The sky simply turned into a wall of moving, powdered ice, and visibility dropped to absolute zero in a matter of minutes. For the thousands of children in one-room schoolhouses and the farmers working in their fields, this sudden whiteout arrived at the worst possible moment, right at dismissal time. The harrowing accounts from that day are stories of impossible choices and heartbreaking consequences. Teachers in countless rural schoolhouses were faced with a horrific dilemma. Do they keep the children inside, risking the stove running out of fuel and everyone freezing to death if the storm lasted for days? Or do they send them home into a maelstrom where they could become lost and freeze just feet from safety? Many teachers made the brave decision to keep their students huddled inside, burning desks, books, and even the very floorboards of the schoolhouse itself to keep the fire going through the brutal night. Their quick thinking saved countless lives. For those caught in the open, the results were devastating. The most famous story of survival is that of schoolteacher Lois Royce in Nebraska, who attempted to lead 3 of her young students to the safety of her boarding house just 200 yards away. They became disoriented instantly in the blinding swirl, and all 3 children perished in her arms. She herself suffered severe frostbite and lost her feet to amputation. Others met similar fates. Minnie Freeman, another Nebraska teacher, famously survived by tying her students together with a rope and leading them single file through the storm to the safety of her own home half a mile away, a miraculous feat of leadership and courage. Yet for every story of survival, there were many more of tragedy. Entire families were lost trying to find each other. Fathers were found frozen solid in their fields, having failed to outrun the cold. Mothers and children were discovered in drifts just steps from their own front doors. The official death toll exceeded 235, but many historians believe the true number was much higher, with countless victims, often children, who were never found until the spring thaw. While the schoolhouse blizzard was a tragedy born of sudden, deceptive cold, another storm just a few decades later would prove that even the most modern and sophisticated of cities were not immune to nature's fury. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, was the stage for this next disaster, a storm that combined freakish weather with a catastrophic structural failure. The event would forever be known as the Knickerbocker Storm, named for the grand movie palace whose collapse on a snowy January night became one of the deadliest weather-related disasters in the city's history. The meteorological setup for this storm was itself unusual. For 2 full days, from January 27th to 28th, 1922, a powerful low-pressure system stalled just off the Atlantic coast. This position acted like a massive pump, pulling a continuous, dense stream of moisture-laden air from the ocean and dumping it directly over the District of Columbia and surrounding areas. The result wasn't the typical light, powdery snow of a cold snap. This was an exceptionally heavy, wet snow, the kind that clings to every branch and power line, accumulating with a crushing weight. By the time it finally ceased, Washington was buried under 28 inches of this concrete-like snow, a record that still stands to this day. The sheer weight of the accumulation was immense, estimated at over 60 million tons, pressing down on the city's rooftops. On the evening of January 28th, despite the continuing snowfall, hundreds of Washingtonians sought refuge and entertainment at the Knickerbocker Theater, the city's largest and most luxurious movie house. The venue was packed. The featured attraction was a popular comedy film, Get Rich Quick Wallingford, and the audience was a cross-section of the capital's society, from politicians and diplomats to families and students. They were all blissfully unaware that the building itself was a tragedy waiting to happen. The Knickerbocker's elegant flat roof, the largest of its kind indeed. C was a feat of ambitious design but flawed engineering. It was supported not by sturdy steel trusses but by an insufficient framework of wooden beams. Architects and engineers had warned that such a design could not handle the heavy snow loads common to the region, but their concerns were overlooked in the pursuit of architectural grandeur. The collapse was as sudden as it was total. At around 9 o'clock in the evening, as the film played, the audience first heard a series of loud creaks and cracks from above. Within seconds, the entire roof gave way. The supporting wall buckled, and with a thunderous roar, the roof and the 2-ton steel girder that supported the balcony crashed down onto the audience below. The ensuing chaos was nightmarish. Patrons were buried under a mountain of snow, plaster, shattered wood, and twisted metal. In an instant, the opulent theater had become a tomb. The response was immediate as police, firefighters, and even soldiers from nearby barracks rushed to the scene. They were joined by ordinary citizens who grabbed shovels and rushed to dig through the rubble with their bare hands, desperately trying to free the trapped and injured. The rescue efforts continued through the night and into the next day, hampered by the relentless snow and the precarious nature of the wreckage. The final toll was devastating. 98 people lost their lives and over 130 were injured. The city was plunged into a state of shock and mourning. The disaster dominated national headlines, not just for the horrific loss of life, but for the stark lesson it delivered about human complacency. The Knickerbocker storm was a brutal reminder that technological progress and urban development meant little if the fundamental principles of safety and engineering were ignored. In its wake, the city enacted much stricter building codes, mandating stronger materials and requiring engineers to calculate for maximum potential snow load, a legacy written in tragedy that undoubtedly prevented future catastrophes. While the Knickerbocker tragedy was a localized disaster born of structural failure, the next storm on our list was a continental-scale monster, a meteorological masterpiece of devastation that carved a path of destruction unlike any before it. The final days of November 1950 saw the atmosphere over North America arrange itself into a perfect and perfectly terrifying pattern. A massive high-pressure system, a dome of incredibly cold, dense air, became anchored over the Rocky Mountains. At the same time, a deep, low-pressure system began to intensify over the Carolinas. This setup created a colossal funnel, pulling that trapped Arctic air not south, not west, but on a highly unusual clockwise loop, dragging it east and then south in a bitter, frigid river directly into the heart of the nation. This bizarre counterclockwise hook is what truly defined the storm, a track so rare and destructive that meteorologists would later classify it as the ultimate example of a retrograde cyclone, and it would forever be known as the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950. The storm's wrath was twofold, and it delivered each element with brutal efficiency. As the system deepened, it generated hurricane-force winds that screamed across the Midwest and Ohio Valley. In Pittsburgh, gusts were recorded at nearly 80 miles per hour, tearing roofs from buildings, toppling countless trees, and snapping power lines like thread. The city was plunged into darkness, and the eerie howl of the wind became a constant soundtrack for days. But the wind was only the delivery mechanism for the storm's second weapon, a catastrophic plunge in temperature. That funneled Arctic air sent thermometers into a freefall. In places like Wheeling, West Virginia, temperatures dropped an astonishing 50 degrees in a single day. The fierce wind combined with this sudden, deep cold to create lethal wind chills that froze pipes solid, halted all machinery, and made any exposure to the outdoors a life-threatening risk. Meanwhile, on the other side of this vast weather system, a completely different disaster was unfolding. The same potent flow of moisture that was pulling down the cold air was also being slammed into the slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. This orographic lift, where moist air is forced up and over high terrain, acted like a massive snow machine. The result was epic, historic snowfall. Ohio was buried under a blanket of white that broke every record in the books. Steubenville received 44 inches, while nearby communities saw totals ranging from 30 to over 50 inches. The weight of this immense, heavy snow collapsed factories, schools, and homes. Travel became impossible, with every road and highway completely obliterated from the landscape, stranding thousands of motorists and isolating entire towns for a week or more. The human and economic toll was staggering. When the winds finally calmed and the snow stopped falling, the grim accounting began. 353 people lost their lives to the storm's multifaceted assault, some from collapsing buildings, others from heart attacks while shoveling the tremendous snow, and many more from hypothermia and traffic accidents during the initial blast of wind and cold. The storm became one of the costliest natural disasters in American history up to that time, with damages estimated at over $66 million, a figure that would translate to nearly $700 million today. Its impact was so profound that it helped cement the need for a more unified national weather warning system. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is in the world of meteorology. For decades, scientists used the storm as the benchmark for extreme weather. It consistently ranked as the #1 storm for both its immense size and its devastating societal impact in historical weather studies, a grim title it held until finally being surpassed by a hurricane decades later. The Great Appalachian Storm wasn't just a blizzard, it was a brutal lesson in atmospheric power, a perfect storm that showed just how many ways winter could unleash its fury upon an unprepared nation. While the Appalachian Storm was a sprawling event that terrorized an entire region, the next blizzard on our list proved that even a single, mighty city could be brought to its knees by a direct hit. For Chicago, a city famously accustomed to and even proud of its harsh winters, the events of January 26th and 27th, 1967, would become the benchmark against which all other snowstorms were measured. This wasn't just a heavy snowfall, it was a siege. The storm began innocently enough, with light flakes starting to fall around 5 in the morning on that Thursday. But within hours, the gentle fall transformed into a relentless, pounding assault. For 29 uninterrupted hours, snow fell at an average rate of nearly an inch per hour, a breathtaking pace that quickly overwhelmed every piece of machinery and every best-laid plan the city possessed. By the time the sky finally cleared, 23 inches of snow had smothered Chicago, a record that would stand for over 30 years. This was not a light, fluffy snow. It was a dense, water-heavy blanket that weighed an estimated 75 million tons, collapsing roofs, snapping tree limbs, and bringing the bustling metropolis to a complete and utter standstill. The most iconic and terrifying images of the disaster came from Lake Shore Drive, the city's scenic artery running alongside Lake Michigan. As the snow intensified during the evening rush hour, thousands of commuters found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Cars, buses, and trucks became hopelessly stuck in the deepening drifts, creating a literal traffic jam of ice and steel that stretched for miles. Over 50,000 vehicles were abandoned as people faced the impossible choice of staying put and freezing or attempting to find shelter on foot in blinding, waist-deep snow. Many chose to walk, leading to surreal scenes of businessmen and mothers trudging through the whiteout, leaving their cars running with the heaters on in a futile hope they could return. These abandoned vehicles, their headlights glowing faintly under the mounting snow, became eerie monuments to the storm's power, frozen in place like a ghost fleet. Yet, in the heart of this chaos, the true character of the city emerged. With official rescue efforts completely overwhelmed, ordinary Chicagoans became the first responders. Residents living in the high-rise apartments along Lake Shore Drive looked down upon the stranded motorists and swung into action. They opened their doors, transforming lobbies and apartments into impromptu shelters. They bundled up and ventured out into the storm with thermoses of hot coffee, sandwiches, and blankets, delivering them car to car. People opened their pantries without a second thought, sharing whatever food they had with complete strangers. The abandoned cars themselves, once symbols of helplessness, were repurposed. Families huddled inside them for warmth, sharing stories and resources, creating fleeting, intimate communities bound together by shared adversity. It was a spontaneous and massive display of civic spirit, a testament to the fact that even when the systems we rely on fail, human decency can still prevail. The city's official infrastructure, however, was in shambles for days. O'Hare Airport, then the busiest in the world, was shut down completely, stranding thousands of travelers. Every single school was closed and most businesses remained shuttered. The monumental task of digging out began, but it was slow, arduous work. The sheer volume of snow meant there was nowhere to put it all. Front-end loaders stacked it into mountains that wouldn't fully melt until spring. The Chicago blizzard of '67 left an indelible mark on the city's psyche. It was a humbling event that showed no amount of urban sophistication could truly tame nature's fury, but it also became a legendary story of resilience, a moment Chicagoans of that generation would forever point to as proof of their city's tough, unbreakable spirit. It's one thing for a blizzard to dominate a region or even a single coast, but the storm that began brewing in the second week of March 1993 was a beast of an entirely different magnitude. Meteorologists watching the data pour in saw the ingredients for a cataclysm coming together with a chilling precision. A massive blast of Arctic air was plunging south from Canada, while simultaneously, a potent area of low pressure began to intensify over the Gulf of Mexico, feeding on the warm, moist air there. These two forces were on a collision course, and when they met, they didn't just create a storm, they created a superstorm. This wasn't merely a winter event, it was a full-scale atmospheric bomb that would earn a name so grand it could not be ignored: the storm of the century. The statistics that define this event are so extreme they seem almost fictional. The storm's footprint was simply unprecedented, affecting an estimated 100 million people across 26 states and parts of Canada, and even reaching into Central America. Its central barometric pressure dropped to a record-shattering low, a reading so deep it was comparable to a Category 3 hurricane, but over a vastly larger area. This immense energy fueled hurricane-force wind gusts that were recorded from the Florida Panhandle all the way up into Maine. These winds whipped the snow into drifts that buried entire houses and created blinding whiteout conditions that made travel an absolute impossibility. But the snow itself was only part of the story. This storm delivered every possible form of severe weather imaginable. Along the Gulf Coast, it wasn't snow but tornadoes that ripped through communities, with over a dozen separate twisters touching down in Florida alone. Further north, the system delivered a spectacular and terrifying phenomenon known as thundersnow, where lightning flashed and thunder boomed amidst the heavy snowfall, a rare and disorienting experience for those caught in its path. Despite the apocalyptic scale of the destruction, the storm of the century also marked a monumental achievement in meteorological science. For the first time, forecasters at the National Weather Service had a powerful new tool at their disposal: sophisticated computer forecast models that accurately predicted the storm's development and path a full 5 days in advance. This gave officials an unprecedented window to prepare. Warnings were issued with a clarity and urgency never before seen for a winter storm. Governors declared states of emergency before the first flake fell. Airlines preemptively canceled thousands of flights, schools and businesses shut down. People heeded the warnings, flocking to grocery stores to stock up on supplies and batteries, a phenomenon that itself became known as the bread and milk run. This massive, coordinated preparation effort undoubtedly saved thousands of lives, proving the immense value of accurate, long-range forecasting. Yet, even with all that preparation, the storm's raw power was simply too much to fully withstand. The chaos that unfolded was widespread and profound. Every major airport along the eastern seaboard was shut down completely. Every highway from Atlanta to Portland, Maine was closed, stranding millions. In the South, cities like Birmingham, Alabama, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, were buried under depths of snow they had no equipment to handle, completely paralyzing them. The human cost was devastating, with over 300 fatalities directly attributed to the storm. People died from heart attacks while shoveling the incredibly heavy, wet snow. Others perished in traffic accidents or from carbon monoxide poisoning while sitting in cars stuck in monumental drifts, their tailpipes clogged by snow. The storm of the century left behind a complex legacy. It was a tragedy that highlighted the deadly force of nature, but it was also a triumph of modern science that showed we were finally learning to read the atmosphere's most dangerous signals, giving humanity a fighting chance against the inevitable next superstorm. Just 2.5 years after the storm of the century rewrote the rulebook for superstorms, the East Coast found itself in the crosshairs of another historic event, one that would showcase a very different kind of danger. The North American blizzard of 1996 was a classic nor'easter, a storm that took a well-trodden path up the Atlantic coastline, but its intensity was anything but ordinary. Over the course of 3 days in early January, it unloaded a mind-boggling amount of snow, with totals ranging from 20 to 48 inches from Washington, D.C. straight through to Boston. This wasn't a storm that merely disrupted life. It enacted a full-scale economic shutdown of the most densely populated corridor in the United States. The immediate impact was a complete paralysis of commerce. Every major airport from Reagan National to Logan was shuttered for days, canceling over 5,000 flights and stranding hundreds of thousands of travelers. The rail network, particularly Amtrak's critical Northeast corridor, ground to a halt as deep drifts buried the tracks. Interstates like 95 became parking lots, with thousands of trucks carrying vital goods stuck in place, unable to deliver their cargo. The total cost of this shutdown was staggering, with initial estimates pegging the economic impact at a breathtaking $3 billion, a figure that would translate to over $5 billion today, making it one of the costliest winter storms in American history at that time. The monumental challenge for city governments wasn't just the initial snowfall, but the Herculean task of what to do with it all. In Philadelphia, which received 30 inches, and New York City, which was buried under 20, the problem became one of simple physics and logistics. There was simply nowhere left to put the snow. Plows created massive berms that blocked intersections and buried fire hydrants. Front-end loaders and dump trucks worked around the clock in massive convoys, hauling tons of snow to designated snow farms, open lots, parks, and even barges on the Hudson River. This operation was astronomically expensive, costing major cities tens of millions of dollars in overtime pay, equipment maintenance, and disposal fees, adding a deep financial wound to the already staggering economic losses from the shutdown. The snow itself became a contaminated mess, mixed with garbage, road salt, and chemical de-icers, creating an environmental headache that would linger long after the melt. And then the melt began. A rapid and dramatic warm-up just a few days after the storm ceased triggered the next chapter of the disaster. All that snow, which represented trillions of gallons of water, had to go somewhere, and it did all at once. The sheer volume of meltwater overwhelmed storm drains and sewer systems that were still partially clogged with ice and debris. In Pennsylvania and New Jersey, rivers like the Susquehanna and the Delaware swelled to flood stage, inundating towns that had just finished digging out from under the snow. The rapid runoff carried a toxic cocktail of road salt, oil, and other pollutants into streams and rivers, causing significant environmental damage and threatening water supplies. This secondary flooding caused hundreds of millions of dollars in additional damage to homes and businesses that had already weathered the storm itself, a cruel second act that demonstrated how a blizzard's impact could evolve long after the skies had cleared. The North American blizzard of '96 was a masterclass in compound disasters, proving that the true cost of a storm isn't just measured in inches of snow, but in the cascading failures it triggers across our infrastructure and economy. Imagine the disbelief of stepping outside on a morning in early May, expecting to feel the warm sun and smell the freshly turned earth of spring planting, only to be met with a biting wind and the first flakes of what would become a full-blown blizzard. This was the surreal reality for residents of Minnesota in the first week of May 1977. The entire state had already enjoyed a beautiful, mild April. Fruit trees were in bloom, farmers had their crops in the ground, and winter felt like a distant memory. The idea of a snowstorm, let alone a historic blizzard, was the farthest thing from anyone's mind. But the atmosphere had a cruel twist in store. A powerful low-pressure system, more typical of January, developed over the Dakotas and began pulling a massive plume of moisture north from the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, a lingering, stubborn pocket of cold Arctic air was sitting over Canada. The storm acted like a pump, drawing that frigid air south and slamming it directly into the Gulf moisture. The result was a meteorological anomaly so rare it seemed almost impossible. A paralyzing, heavy snowstorm at the absolute tail end of spring. The storm raged for 2 full days, from May 6th to the 7th, and it was relentless. While the Twin Cities saw a significant 7 inches, the real fury was concentrated in the southwestern and west-central regions of the state. There, snow fell at rates of over 2 inches per hour, driven by winds that gusted to hurricane force, creating total whiteout conditions. When it finally ended, the landscape was utterly transformed. The town of Canby reported a staggering 24 inches. Throughout the region, measurements of 20 to 30 inches were common, with colossal drifts piling up to 10 and 15 feet high. The weight of this heavy, wet May snow was immense, snapping power lines and tree limbs that were already heavy with new leaves, leaving thousands without electricity. But the most surreal and devastating impact was on the land itself. Vast fields of newly sprouted corn, soybeans, and wheat were entombed under the deep, frozen blanket. Orchards of blooming apple and cherry trees were crushed under the weight, their delicate blossoms frozen solid and shattered. The vibrant green of spring was erased, replaced by a silent, oppressive white that looked more like the heart of January than the promise of May. For the region's farmers, this was not an inconvenience. It was an unmitigated catastrophe unfolding at the worst possible time of the year. Spring is the season of new life on a farm, and many livestock owners were in the middle of lambing and calving season. The storm hit with such speed that there was no time to fully secure animals. Newborn calves and lambs, the most vulnerable creatures on the farm, were caught in the open and faced almost certain death from hypothermia. The stories from that week are testaments to both profound loss and incredible determination. Farmers and their families undertook desperate, heroic efforts to save their herds. They worked through the blinding snow, often by hand, to lead bewildered cows into barns that were already overcrowded. They broke through monstrous drifts with tractors to reach stranded animals. Perhaps the most enduring image of the storm is that of farmers carrying newborn calves and lambs into their own homes, their kitchens and living rooms transformed into makeshift maternity wards. They swaddled the shivering animals in blankets and warmed them by wood stoves, feeding them with bottles to keep them alive. It was a heartbreaking scene, a brutal clash between the nurturing instinct of the farmer and the indiscriminate fury of nature. Despite these valiant efforts, the losses were staggering. Thousands of newborn animals perished. For those that survived, the stress of the storm and the sudden deep cold led to widespread illness and complications that would affect their health for months. The damage to the crops was total and complete. The seedlings, so full of potential just days before, were frozen and crushed beyond recovery. This meant not just the loss of a year's income, but the immense cost of having to replant entire fields once the snow finally melted, if the ground could even be worked again in time. The financial toll on Minnesota's agriculture was devastating, ultimately reaching into the tens of millions of dollars. The May blizzard of '77 left a deep scar on the rural community, a bizarre and brutal reminder that the turn of the calendar is no match for the unpredictable power of the atmosphere. It became a benchmark event, a story that farmers would tell for generations, a warning that in the upper Midwest, winter sometimes refuses to leave without one final, devastating blow. While the May blizzard was a shocking seasonal anomaly, the city of Buffalo, New York, was about to endure a winter catastrophe of a completely different nature, one born from a relentless accumulation of misfortune. The infamous blizzard of 1977 wasn't just a single storm. It was the terrifying culmination of an entire winter's worth of snow, set into motion by a perfect and deadly alignment of meteorological events. The stage had been set over the preceding months. The winter of 1976 to '77 had been one of the most severe on record for western New York, with constant snows and bitter cold that never seemed to relent. By the end of January, the ground was already buried under a deep, solid base of snow. Most critically, Lake Erie, the shallowest of the Great Lakes, had frozen over completely for the first time in decades, its surface covered by a thick, windswept sheet of ice. This unusual ice cover would become a crucial ingredient in the coming disaster, transforming the lake from a source of moderating warmth into a barren, frozen plain ready to give up its Chinese letter. The catalyst arrived on January 28th, a powerful Arctic cold front accompanied by a massive high-pressure system began to descend from Canada. This system brought with it a ferocious, sustained wind, with gusts that would eventually reach an incredible 75 miles per hour. These hurricane-force winds screamed across the frozen surface of Lake Erie, but with the lake iced over, there was no open water to provide moisture for typical lake-effect snow. Instead, the wind performed a different, terrifying function. It acted like a colossal vacuum cleaner, scouring the entire frozen lake surface and the snow-covered landscapes of Ontario, lifting hundreds of thousands of tons of old, powdery snow into the air. This was not falling snow from a cloud. This was a moving mountain of reclaimed ice crystals, a ground blizzard of unimaginable intensity. The wind whipped this material into a blinding, suffocating swirl that reduced visibility to absolute zero for days on end. It was less a snowstorm and more a prolonged, frozen whiteout, a complete erasure of the world that made it impossible to see your own hand in front of your face. For the people of Buffalo and its surrounding suburbs, this meant being plunged into an abyss of howling whiteness for 3 interminable days. The wind chill factor plunged to 60 degrees below zero, making any exposure to the outdoors instantly life-threatening. The drifting was catastrophic, with the wind sculpting the new and old snow into monumental dunes that completely buried single-story homes and reached the second-floor windows of others. The city was utterly paralyzed. Every road vanished, emergency services were completely halted, power failed, and with it, heat. People were trapped wherever the storm had caught them, isolated in their homes, offices, or stranded vehicles. In this profound isolation, a desperate form of community and innovation emerged. With doors blocked by 15-foot drifts, residents in neighborhoods like Cheektowaga and Lancaster began to tunnel. They used shovels, pots, and pans to carve intricate networks of passageways through the compacted snow, creating subterranean connections between houses. These tunnels became lifelines, allowing neighbors to check on the elderly, share dwindling food and fuel supplies, and provide warmth and company in the midst of the terrifying siege. The official response, when it finally became possible, was a monumental undertaking. The National Guard was called in, but even their heavy equipment was often no match for the sheer scale of the drifts. The most critical rescues were conducted by guardsmen on snowmobiles, who navigated the featureless, frozen landscape guided by little more than memory and desperation. listening for the faint sounds of people tapping on pipes or windows from inside buried homes. They performed heroic, daring rescues, pulling people from frozen cars and collapsing buildings. One of the most dramatic efforts was the aerial rescue of motorists stranded on the New York State Thruway, where hundreds of cars and trucks had been abandoned in a massive, snow-buried traffic jam. Helicopters braved the lingering winds to airlift people to safety. The final toll was heartbreaking. 29 people lost their lives in the storm itself, with many more perishing from heart attacks during the exhausting dig-out that followed. The blizzard of '77 left an indelible mark on Buffalo's identity, a testament to both the city's incredible vulnerability to the whims of nature and the profound resilience of its people when faced with an absolute frozen darkness. Just as Buffalo was digging out from its nightmarish blizzard, another historic storm was already taking shape, one that would strike the densely populated corridor of New England with a fury that would redefine the region's relationship with winter. The blizzard of 1978, often called the storm of the century by those who lived through it, was a meteorological monster born from a rare and perfect alignment of atmospheric forces. Unlike a typical nor'easter, this storm involved a second, weaker low-pressure system developing off the coast of North Carolina. This secondary low acted like a booster rocket, merging with the primary storm and causing it to undergo a process known as bombogenesis, where its central pressure dropped at an astonishing rate. This created a vacuum effect, pulling in surrounding air with unimaginable force and setting the stage for an unprecedented onslaught of wind and snow. The storm made landfall during the afternoon high tide on February 6th, a timing that maximized its destructive potential. The first sign of its awesome power was not the snow but the wind. Sustained winds of 86 miles per hour were recorded in Boston, with gusts screaming to over 100 miles per hour, hurricane-force winds that turned every snowflake into a stinging projectile. These winds pushed a catastrophic storm surge into the coast, with waves towering over 25 feet high. They smashed into seaside communities from Rhode Island to Massachusetts, obliterating historic homes, sweeping entire structures out to sea, and flooding coastal highways with a churning mix of ice and ocean water. The combination of blizzard and flood created a dual disaster, isolating whole communities as the roads leading in and out were simultaneously buried and washed away. Inland, the snow was nothing short of biblical. It fell at a rate of 3 to 4 inches per hour for an entire day, a relentless, blinding onslaught that accumulated to a depth of 27 inches in Boston and over 54 inches in parts of Rhode Island. The sheer weight of this snow, estimated at over 75 million tons in Massachusetts alone, collapsed countless roofs from factory buildings to home porches. But the most iconic and terrifying image of the storm was the complete paralysis of the region's transportation network. Interstate 95, the main artery of New England, became a frozen graveyard of thousands of cars, buses, and trucks. Drivers were caught completely unaware by the storm's rapid intensification and found themselves stranded in massive drifts, their vehicles disappearing under the snow. An estimated 3,000 cars and 500 trucks were abandoned on the highways, their occupants forced to either wait for a rescue that might not come or attempt a perilous trek through the whiteout. For those stranded, the experience was one of profound isolation and psychological strain. People were trapped in their cars for days, burning whatever they could find for warmth as food and fuel supplies dwindled. The constant, deafening howl of the wind and the complete whiteness outside created a disorienting sensory deprivation. In homes, families huddled together as power failed and temperatures plummeted, listening to the ominous creaks and groans of their roofs straining under the immense weight. The isolation was absolute, with phone lines down and travel impossible. People had no way of knowing if their loved ones were safe or if help was even coming. This prolonged entrapment forced a deep self-reliance, with neighbors banding together to check on the elderly and share meager supplies. but it also planted lasting seeds of anxiety about winter weather for a generation of New Englanders. The eventual rescue effort was one of the largest peacetime mobilizations in American history. The National Guard was deployed with armored personnel carriers and snowmobiles to navigate the impassable streets. In a truly extraordinary move, citizen volunteers with snowmobiles and four-wheel drive vehicles were deputized by the state government to become an impromptu emergency response team, dubbed the Rhode Island Militia. They delivered medicine to the sick, transported doctors and nurses to hospitals, and rescued countless people from stranded vehicles and freezing homes. The storm's aftermath revealed critical failures in preparedness and communication, but it also sparked a revolution in how such disasters are handled. The painful lessons learned led directly to the creation of modern emergency broadcast systems, stricter requirements for states to stockpile snow removal equipment and salt, and a new emphasis on the science of forecasting. The blizzard of '78 was a brutal teacher, but its lessons in resilience and preparedness are woven into the fabric of New England's emergency response to this very day. While New England was reeling from its catastrophic storm, an almost identical meteorological monster was simultaneously taking aim at the heart of the American Midwest. The Ohio Valley blizzard of 1978 was in many ways the twin of the New England disaster, born from the same rare atmospheric setup just a few days later. A powerful low-pressure system underwent the same rapid bombogenesis over the southern plains, pulling a vast reservoir of Arctic air down from Canada and slamming it into Gulf moisture with devastating effect. For the residents of Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Michigan, the ordeal began on the morning of January 26 with a forecast that seemed routine, a winter storm warning. But what arrived was anything but routine. It was an absolute white hurricane that would prove just as deadly and transformative for the interior of the country as its coastal counterpart. The storm's assault on the Midwest was defined by its two most brutal weapons: hurricane-force winds and a paralyzing, wind-driven snow known as a ground blizzard. Winds gusting consistently between 60 and 80 miles per hour didn't just fall from the sky. They scoured the frozen farmlands of Ohio and Indiana, lifting every loose bit of snow from the previous weeks and mixing it with the new falling snow to create a suffocating airborne concrete. Visibility didn't just drop to zero. It remained at zero for over 48 hours in some places, creating a prolonged state of sensory deprivation where the world was reduced to a roaring white nothingness. The wind chill factor plunged to an almost incomprehensible 60 degrees below zero, a level of cold that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and made any attempt to venture outside a potentially fatal gamble. The human impact was immediate and horrifying. Unlike the coastal storm, which had a significant flooding component, the Ohio Valley's disaster was one of pure, frozen entrapment. Thousands of motorists were caught on the highways, most notably on Interstate 71 in Ohio and the Indiana Toll Road. They became stranded in their vehicles, buried by the monumental drifts that quickly grew to 15 and 20 feet high. Without the ocean's moderating influence, the cold here was even more severe, and many who tried to walk for help from their stranded cars became disoriented and perished mere yards from safety. The stories of survival were etched in desperation. People burned their tires for warmth, huddled together for body heat, and rationed what little food they had. The storm's timing hitting during a weekday meant that many people were separated from their families, stranded at work or in schools, with no way to communicate or know if their loved ones were safe. In the end, the storm was blamed for over 70 deaths across the region, a tragic testament to its ferocity. In the storm's grim aftermath, as the Midwest dug out from under the mountains of snow, a pressing and uncomfortable question began to emerge. Why were so many people caught so completely off guard? The forecasts had technically been correct. A winter storm was coming, but the language used failed to communicate the historic, life-threatening severity of what was actually approaching. The terms winter storm warning and heavy snow warning had over time become somewhat normalized. People heard them and thought of a difficult commute or a day off from school, not a civilization-halting event that could kill them if they were on the road. The public had become desensitized, and the meteorological vocabulary was simply not equal to the task of describing a storm of this magnitude. This critical failure in communication became the catalyst for one of the most important modernizations in weather history. Meteorologists and emergency managers, determined to never let such a tragedy happen again, recognized the need for a new tier of warning, one with language so stark and severe it would cut through the public's complacency. From this need, the blizzard warning was formally created and integrated into the National Weather Service's official lexicon. This wasn't just a new name. It was a specific, criteria-based alert requiring a combination of sustained winds over 35 miles per hour and falling or blowing snow that reduces visibility to a quarter of a mile or less for at least 3 hours. The term blizzard was chosen deliberately for its cultural weight, its connotation of ultimate severity. The goal was to make people stop and truly listen, to understand that a blizzard warning signaled an event that was not merely disruptive but genuinely deadly. The Ohio Valley blizzard of '78, for all its devastation, left a legacy that has saved countless lives since, forging a language of warning that is as powerful as the storms it describes. Just when the brutal lessons of the great storms of the '70s and '80s seemed to have taught Americans to expect the worst from winter, nature delivered a blizzard that was less about fury and more about sheer, bizarre timing. For the residents of Minnesota, the final days of October 1991 typically involved pumpkins, costumes, and the crisp, dry chill of autumn. But that year, the atmosphere had a prank in store that would eclipse any Halloween trick. A massive low-pressure system, more characteristic of January, began to deepen over the Central Plains, pulling a fire hose of moisture north from the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, a cold front draped across Canada began to sag southward, injecting a shot of unseasonably frigid air into the mix. This collision didn't produce a typical fall rainstorm. It spawned a full-blown, historic blizzard that would forever rename Halloween for an entire generation of Minnesotans. The storm began its assault on October 31st, and it was unrelenting. For 3 straight days, snow fell at an astonishing rate, driven by winds that gusted to 45 miles per hour. When the clouds finally parted on November 3rd, the landscape was utterly transformed. The twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul were buried under 28 inches of snow, breaking all-time records for a single storm in the month of October. The weight of this heavy, wet snow, a concrete-like mix that fell before the ground had even frozen, was immense. It snapped thousands of tree limbs that were still heavy with autumn leaves, downing power lines and leaving over 100,000 people in the dark. The sheer volume of snow brought the state to a standstill. Airports canceled over 1,200 flights, and every major highway was rendered impassable, stranding travelers and commuters alike. But the most surreal and immediate impact was on the holiday itself, as a night dedicated to ghosts and goblins was instantly rewritten by a swirling white nightmare. The universal cancellation of trick-or-treating across the region led to one of the most peculiar and heartwarming community responses in blizzard history. With children staring out their windows at a world that had vanished under a 3-foot blanket of white, parents and neighbors sprang into action with incredible creativity. The classic image of the storm isn't one of buried cars or stranded motorists, but of determined children bundled in winter coats over their costumes, trudging through chest-deep snowdrifts on snowshoes and cross-country skis, pillowcases in hand. Entire neighborhoods organized impromptu snowshoe trick-or-treat events, with groups of parents leading expeditions from house to house, carving paths through the drifts for their little witches and superheroes. For those who couldn't venture out, the spirit of the holiday was preserved through ingenious adaptations. Many families took to simply driving their costumed kids from one relative's house to another, creating a miniature indoor candy circuit. Others hosted blizzard block parties, where neighbors pooled their candy and hosted open houses, allowing children to collect their treats from a single, warm location without having to brave the elements. The storm's legacy is unique among American blizzards. It caused over $100 million in damage to the state's infrastructure and trees, but it is rarely remembered for its destruction. Instead, the Halloween blizzard of '91 is recalled with a sense of fondness and resilient humor. It became a defining shared experience, a story that every Minnesotan who lived through it can tell you exactly where they were. It's remembered for the sight of a lone jack-o'-lantern peeking out from a massive snowdrift, for the Batman costume worn over a snowmobile suit, and for the collective shrug of a community that simply refused to let a historic act of nature cancel its holiday. The storm demonstrated that even the most extreme weather could be met not just with preparedness, but with adaptability and a wonderfully Midwestern sense of good cheer, proving that sometimes the strangest blizzards are the ones that bring out the best in us. If you thought a Halloween blizzard was strange, try telling that to the farmers and ranchers of the Northern Plains who woke up on April 1, 1997, to what must have felt like a particularly cruel joke from Mother Nature. After a long, hard winter, spring had finally seemed to be taking hold. The snow had melted, fields were beginning to thaw, and the first signs of new life were appearing across the landscape. The forecast for a major storm was met with a fair amount of skepticism. After all, it was April Fool's Day, but the atmosphere was not laughing. A powerful low-pressure system, a classic Colorado low, had other plans. It intensified rapidly as it tracked northward, pulling a massive amount of moisture from the Gulf of Mexico and slamming it into a still-present reservoir of cold air draped across the Dakotas and Minnesota. What began as rain on March 31st quickly changed over to snow, and it didn't let up for 36 relentless hours. This was not a gentle, powdery snowfall. It was a full-fledged blizzard with winds howling at 50 to 60 miles per hour, whipping the snow into a blinding, suffocating frenzy that created drifts as high as 15 feet. When the skies finally cleared, the numbers were staggering. Grand Forks, North Dakota, was buried under 27 inches. Areas in northeastern South Dakota and western Minnesota reported totals approaching 3 feet. The weight of this heavy, wet, cement-like snow proved too much for countless structures. Storage sheds collapsed, barn roofs buckled, and power lines snapped under the strain, leaving tens of thousands without electricity in the bitter cold that followed the storm. Transportation was rendered completely impossible. Every major highway, including the critical Interstates 29 and 94, was shut down for days, stranding motorists and halting the movement of goods. Air travel was completely suspended, with airports from Fargo to Minneapolis-St. Paul canceling all flights, effectively cutting off the region from the rest of the country at a time when spring business was meant to be ramping up. The most devastating impact, however, was felt not in the cities but across the vast, open ranchlands. For cattle ranchers, the timing of this storm could not have been more catastrophic. This was the height of calving season. Across the region, thousands of cows were giving birth in the open fields, a natural process that is challenging even in good weather. The blizzard hit with such sudden and violent force that these vulnerable newborns and their mothers had little chance. Despite heroic efforts by ranchers who worked tirelessly through the whiteout conditions, often risking their own lives to try and lead animals to shelter, the losses were heartbreaking. Newborn calves, soaked and unable to regulate their body temperature, succumbed to hypothermia by the thousands. Older cattle, disoriented by the blinding snow, wandered into fences and drifts where they became trapped and froze to death. The official estimates placed the death toll at over 100,000 head of livestock. a staggering economic and emotional blow to agricultural families whose entire livelihoods were tied to their herds. The economic ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. The monumental task of digging out was hampered by the sheer volume of snow and the lack of places to put it. Melting the massive piles would take weeks, delaying the critical spring planting season for wheat and other crops and threatening to shorten the already brief growing window. The storm's aftermath also revealed a grim and challenging cleanup. Once the snow began to melt, ranchers were faced with the somber duty of disposing of the countless animal carcasses scattered across their land, a process that was both physically demanding and emotionally draining. The total economic impact for the region climbed into the hundreds of millions of dollars, a severe setback that took years from which some operations never fully recovered. The April Fool's blizzard of '97 served as a brutal reminder that on the northern plains, winter holds the ultimate veto power over the calendar, capable of delivering a knockout punch long after the fight seems over. Even as the Midwest was recovering from its own winter nightmares, a new storm was already gathering strength, one that would exploit the complacency of a holiday weekend to deliver a devastating surprise. The President's Day storm of 1979 took aim at the Mid-Atlantic region, an area that had experienced a relatively mild winter up to that point. The holiday Monday, February 19th, had dawned with a forecast calling for some snow, but nothing that would cause widespread alarm. Many families were enjoying their day off, and the general sentiment was that the worst of winter was likely behind them. This sense of security was a dangerous illusion. The storm system, which had initially been predicted to stay well out to sea, suddenly and unexpectedly executed what meteorologists call a left hook, turning sharply westward and intensifying at a breathtaking rate directly over the populated coastline. This rapid bombogenesis transformed a routine winter weather advisory into a full-blown blizzard warning in a matter of hours, leaving virtually no time for the public or officials to prepare for what was coming. The snow began in earnest during the late afternoon, and it immediately fell with an intensity that shocked everyone. It wasn't a gentle, accumulating snow, it was a furious, wind-driven onslaught. Rates quickly reached 2 to 3 inches per hour, and with temperatures hovering right around freezing, the snow was incredibly wet and heavy. This specific characteristic, the weight of the snow, would become the defining feature of the disaster. The wet snow adhered to every surface with the tenacity of glue, coating power lines, trees, and utility poles. The sheer weight of this accumulation, combined with wind gusts that topped 50 miles per hour, proved too much for the region's infrastructure to bear. All across Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Delaware, the night was punctuated by the deafening cracks of snapping tree limbs and the terrifying sound of transformers exploding in flashes of blue and green light. The electrical grid, stressed beyond its limits, began to fail in a cascading series of outages that would eventually leave over 1 million people without power. For the families now trapped in their dark, rapidly cooling homes, the holiday quickly turned into a fight for survival. The most immediate and dangerous threat was the loss of heat. As the hours turned into days, indoor temperatures began to plummet, mirroring the freezing conditions outside. Stories emerged of entire neighborhoods banding together, with families who still had working fireplaces inviting those who did not into their homes, creating crowded but life-saving shelters. Others resorted to desperate measures, using camping stoves indoors with tragic consequences in some cases, or huddling together in a single room under every blanket they owned. The isolation was profound, with phone lines down and roads completely impassable under 4-foot drifts. There was no way to call for help or even check on elderly relatives living just a few streets away. The familiar comfort of suburbia had been transformed into a frozen, silent landscape of anxiety and uncertainty. In the face of this monumental crisis, the response of utility workers became the stuff of legend. Crews from as far away as Ohio and Tennessee were called in to assist the overwhelmed local teams, but simply reaching the broken poles and downed lines was a Herculean task in itself. These men and women worked around the clock in brutal, freezing conditions, using snowmobiles and even bulldozers to bulldoze paths through neighborhoods that resembled war zones. They faced not only the cold and exhaustion, but also the constant danger of working with heavy equipment and live wires in precarious situations. Their heroic, tireless efforts continued for days, and in some of the more remote rural areas for over a week before power was finally restored to the last affected customers. The President's Day storm served as a brutal lesson for the Mid-Atlantic, exposing the vulnerability of its overhead power lines to heavy, wet snow and ultimately leading to investments in strengthening the grid, though the memory of that sudden, cold darkness would linger for a generation. Just as the late 19th century was drawing to a close, a meteorological event of almost biblical proportions descended upon the United States, an event so severe it would freeze the Deep South in a way that had never been documented before and has never been seen since. The Great Blizzard of 1899, also known as the Great Arctic Outbreak, was not merely a storm. It was a catastrophic rearrangement of the nation's entire climate system for one brutal week in February. The stage was set by a massive and unusually stable high-pressure system that became anchored over Western Canada, a dome of air so dense and cold it began to act like a stopper in the atmospheric bottle. Then, a powerful low-pressure system developed over the Gulf of Mexico, creating a colossal funnel that pulled that trapped Arctic air not in a gentle flow, but in a raging torrent straight down the center of the continent. This wasn't a typical cold front. It was a continent-wide flush of pure, undiluted polar air that swept all the way to the tropical shores of the Gulf. The temperature records set during that first week of February still stand as some of the most unbelievable in American meteorological history. In the nation's capital, the Potomac River froze solid enough for people to walk from Washington, D.C. to Virginia. The mercury plunged to 15 degrees below zero in Atlanta, Georgia, and an astonishing 2 degrees below zero in Tallahassee, Florida, the only sub-zero temperature ever recorded in the Sunshine State. New Orleans experienced a hard freeze, and ice flows were reported in the Mississippi River as far south as New Orleans, but the most surreal event was the snow. Snowfall was recorded in every single state in the Deep South. Floridians from the Panhandle down to Fort Myers awoke to a world dusted in white. The city of Tampa received its first and only measurable snowfall, a half-inch that sent its citizens into a state of bewildered delight and terror. In New Orleans, a 5-inch blanket of snow brought the bustling port city to a silent, frozen standstill. For a region completely unequipped with plows, salt, or even winter clothing, this was not a picturesque winter wonderland. It was an immobilizing catastrophe. The human experience of the cold was one of profound shock and improvisation. Southern homes designed for heat dispersion with high ceilings and large windows were utterly defenseless against the invading cold. Water pipes froze and burst. Citrus growers, in a desperate race against time, tried anything to save their trees. They built small, smoldering fires in their groves, hoping the smoke would create a protective blanket of warmth. They sprayed the trees with water, a technique that backfired spectacularly as the water instantly froze on the branches, adding a heavy layer of ice to the deadly cold. People wrapped their pipes in rags and huddled around meager fireplaces, burning furniture and floorboards to keep from freezing. The sight of palm trees and magnolias draped in ice and snow was a bizarre and terrifying contradiction of nature, a scene that most never believed they would witness in their lifetimes. While the human population shivered through the event, the impact on the agricultural economy of the South was nothing short of apocalyptic. The region's entire citrus industry, centered in Florida, was virtually wiped out in a single night. The brutal cold killed fruit on the tree and froze the sap within the trees themselves, causing them to split open and die. The vast orange, lemon, and lime groves were transformed into frozen, blackened orchards. The destruction was so complete that it forced a permanent geographical shift in American citrus production. Growers who had invested their lives on the central Florida peninsula were financially ruined. In the aftermath, the industry slowly regrouped, but it migrated significantly southward, concentrating around the warmer, more protected Lake Okeechobee area and further down the southern coast, a direct and lasting consequence of the 1899 freeze. The shockwaves extended far beyond citrus. Across Georgia and the Carolinas, the entire peach crop was lost. In Louisiana, the sugar cane crop was devastated, with the frozen stalks rendered useless for processing. Field crops like winter vegetables were completely destroyed. The financial losses were staggering, totaling in the many millions of dollars at a time when that sum represented an almost incomprehensible fortune. The event served as a brutal, unforgettable lesson in the perils of monoculture farming, relying on a single, cold-sensitive crop across a vast region. In the years that followed, southern farmers were forced to adapt. They began planting hardier, more diverse crops. They developed better frost protection techniques, like the modern system of using powerful wind machines to mix warmer air down into the groves on cold nights. The Great Blizzard of 1899 was more than a historical curiosity. It was a pivotal disaster that reshaped the agricultural map of the American South, proving that even the most seemingly stable and warm climates are not immune to the planet's most extreme atmospheric moods. On the morning of November 11, 1940, the weather across the upper Midwest felt more like early September than the brink of winter. In Minneapolis, the temperature soared into the 60s, a welcome reprieve that drew people outdoors to enjoy the unseasonable warmth. It was Armistice Day, a national holiday, and thousands were taking full advantage of the beautiful day. Hunters flocked to the marshes of Minnesota and Wisconsin for what was expected to be a perfect day for waterfowl. Sailors and fishermen took to the massive expanse of Lake Michigan, reassured by the gentle breezes and calm waters. The official weather forecast issued that morning called for cloudy, colder, with rain or snow likely, a prediction that seemed almost laughable under the bright, sunny skies. No one had any inkling that within hours, one of the deadliest and most deceptive blizzards in American history would be upon them. The catalyst for this tragedy was a classic autumn storm system, but its behavior was anything but typical. A low-pressure center that had developed over the Pacific Northwest began to deepen at an alarming rate as it tracked into the Midwest. This rapid intensification caused the storm to essentially stall over the region, pulling a massive amount of moisture north from the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, a huge mass of frigid Arctic air came plunging south from Canada. The collision was sudden and violent. The warm, moist air was violently lifted, and the previously balmy temperatures went into a freefall, dropping more than 50 degrees in just a few hours. The rain that initially began to fall quickly changed over to heavy, wind-driven snow. The transition was so swift that many people who had left home in shirtsleeves found themselves trapped in a life-threatening whiteout with no way to seek shelter. The storm's fury was unleashed with particular cruelty on two groups: the hunters in the Mississippi River backwaters and the sailors on Lake Michigan. For the hunters, the change was disorienting and deadly. One moment they were in a boat or a duck blind under sunny skies, and the next they were battling hurricane-force winds, blinding snow, and a brutal drop in temperature. The landscape they knew so well became a featureless white void. Many became lost just yards from the warmth and safety of their cars or cabins, freezing to death in the marsh grasses. Others died when their small boats were swamped by the sudden, violent waves that churned the usually placid rivers. On Lake Michigan, the situation was even more catastrophic. The suddenness of the storm gave commercial fishermen and pleasure boaters no time to seek safe harbor. waves quickly built to 20 feet or more, swamping and capsizing dozens of vessels. The Coast Guard and other rescue services were completely overwhelmed, unable to launch in the horrific conditions. Ships were found later, washed ashore and encased in ice, their crews frozen solid. In the aftermath, as the region dug out from under up to 27 inches of snow, the full, heartbreaking scale of the loss became clear. 145 people had lost their lives, with 13 of those deaths occurring on a single, tragic ship, the Novadoc, which was found wrecked near Muskegon, Michigan. 49 sailors perished on Lake Michigan, and dozens of hunters were found frozen in the marshes, some still clutching their shotguns. The public outrage was immediate and profound. How could a storm of this magnitude, with such obvious and deadly potential, have arrived with so little warning? The investigation that followed revealed a critical and fatal breakdown in communication. Forecasters at the United States Weather Bureau in Chicago had indeed identified the potential for a severe storm, but their warnings never reached the public in a clear or timely manner. The forecast that was disseminated was vague and failed to convey the imminent, life-threatening danger. By the time the Bureau tried to issue urgent updates, the storm had already knocked out telegraph and telephone lines, silencing their warnings. This communication failure became the driving force behind a complete overhaul of the national weather warning system. The Armistice Day blizzard served as a brutal catalyst for change, proving that accurate forecasting was useless if the information could not be distributed quickly and understood by the public. In direct response, the Weather Bureau implemented a new, prioritized system for issuing urgent warnings, utilizing every available medium, including the relatively new technology of commercial radio, to broadcast storm alerts directly into people's homes. The storm also underscored the critical importance of monitoring weather conditions over the entire continent, not just locally, to better understand how systems develop and interact. The tragedy of November 11, 1940, left an indelible scar on the Midwest, but its legacy is one of saved lives. The reforms it sparked laid the groundwork for the modern, sophisticated alert systems we rely on today. A somber reminder written in snow and ice that a forecast must not only be accurate, but it must also be heard. Yet, even as the nation was learning to issue better warnings for those on land, the deadliest freshwater storm in American history was gathering over the Great Lakes, a tempest so fierce it would earn the name it shares with the Atlantic's most powerful tropical cyclones, the White Hurricane of 1913. For the massive fleet of commercial freighters that plied the waters of Lakes Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Superior, the early days of November were a race against the calendar. The shipping season was drawing to a close, and captains and owners were determined to squeeze in one last, lucrative run across the cold water, carrying coal, iron ore, and grain to fuel the nation's booming industry. The weather forecasts in the days leading up to November 7th were concerning but not yet catastrophic, speaking of strong winds and building waves. No one could have predicted that two mighty storm systems were about to perform a deadly dance over the lakes, merging into a single, unimaginably powerful low-pressure system that would effectively park itself over the region for 4 full days of unrelenting fury. What made this storm so uniquely terrifying for the sailors was its two-pronged attack. First came the wind, which quickly escalated beyond any gale they had ever experienced. Hurricane-force winds, sustained at over 80 miles per hour for hours on end, screamed across the hundreds of miles of open water, whipping the lake surfaces into a chaos of towering waves. These were not the rolling swells of an ocean hurricane. They were steep, sharp, and chaotically confused waves, often coming from multiple directions at once as the storm's center shifted. Mariners reported waves reaching an unbelievable 35 feet in height, mountains of water that would crash over a ship's deck with the force of a freight train. The second weapon was the snow, a thick, blinding mix of heavy flakes and frozen spray that was ripped from the wave tops by the incredible wind. This combination reduced visibility to absolute zero, creating a disorienting white hell where captains lost all sense of direction and horizon, unable to tell sky from water. The result was a maritime catastrophe of an almost biblical scale. Ships that had been riding out the storm suddenly found themselves driven onto rocky shoals and shattered by the waves. Others were simply overwhelmed, their cargoes shifting in the violent seas, causing them to list and capsize in minutes. Most terrifying of all was the fate of those ships that were caught in the open water of Lake Huron. With no safe harbor to run to, they could only try to point their bows into the wind and pray. At least 12 ships were sunk completely, and over 30 more were driven ashore and wrecked. The death toll was horrific. Entire crews were lost, their ships vanishing without a single distress call, swallowed by the lake with all hands. The storm's most famous victim was the giant 500-foot steel freighter Henry B. Smith, which disappeared on Lake Superior with all 25 crew members. On Lake Huron, the wreck of the Charles S. Price became a symbol of the storm's bizarre power. When the battered hull was found floating upside down after the gale, it was initially misidentified, and the personal effects of sailors from a different, missing ship were found inside, suggesting the two vessels had tragically collided in the blinding snow. The staggering loss of 250 sailors and so much property sent a shockwave through the maritime industry and the nation as a whole. The public outcry demanded answers and, more importantly, change. The investigation that followed the White Hurricane led to a revolution in Great Lakes shipping safety that continues to save lives to this day. The first and most critical reform was a massive investment in an expansion of the weather forecasting and warning system specifically for the lakes. More weather stations were built along the shorelines, and the telegraph network was improved to get urgent storm warnings to port masters and ship captains with far greater speed. The storm exposed the fatal flaw of wooden-hulled ships in such extreme conditions, accelerating the industry-wide shift to all-steel construction, which offered far greater strength and resilience against the pounding waves. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the establishment of a coordinated life-saving service, a network of stations equipped with powerful lifeboats and crews trained specifically to brave the stormy lakes to rescue sailors from foundering ships. A service that would eventually evolve into the modern Coast Guard's presence on the Great Lakes. The White Hurricane was a brutal teacher, but the lessons learned in its wake forged a new era of safety upon the inland seas. But if the White Hurricane taught us the importance of maritime warnings, a storm just a few decades later would deliver a stark lesson to one of the nation's great inland cities, proving that even a place famous for its winter toughness could be caught completely off guard. For Chicago, a city that prides itself on its resilience to lake-effect snow and bitter cold, the blizzard of 1999 arrived with an air of dismissive familiarity. The forecasts in the days leading up to January 2nd were clear. A significant winter storm was heading for the Midwest, but in a city that had weathered the legendary 23-inch onslaught of 1967, the predictions for 10 to 14 inches seemed like a manageable, if inconvenient, start to the new year. This confidence would prove to be a critical mistake. The storm, a potent clipper system energized by abundant moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, did not follow the script. It intensified rapidly as it zeroed in on northeastern Illinois, and the snow began falling on that Saturday with a relentless, pounding intensity that veteran meteorologists would later describe as some of the heaviest snowfall rates they had ever witnessed. The city's first and most shocking symbol of defeat was its crown jewel of transportation, O'Hare International Airport. As the world's busiest airport, O'Hare is a meticulously tuned machine, a critical node in the global network designed to operate through almost anything. But the blizzard of '99 brought this giant to its knees completely and absolutely. For the first time in over 3 decades, the entire airport was shut down. Not a single flight took off or landed for 36 hours. The scenes inside the terminals were ones of surreal, escalating chaos. Thousands of travelers who had arrived for domestic flights found themselves trapped as concourses became clogged with stranded passengers. With every hotel within a 50-mile radius fully booked, people resorted to creating makeshift camps on terminal floors, using rolled-up jackets for pillows and rationing the dwindling supplies from shuttered newsstands and fast food restaurants. The stories from those 2 days are a tapestry of human endurance, from parents fashioning diapers for infants out of airline blankets to groups of strangers pooling their cash to share a single, exorbitantly priced pizza delivered by a brave delivery driver who somehow navigated the mounting drifts. While the airport's plight made national headlines, a quieter, more profound struggle was unfolding in the city's neighborhoods. The official total of 21.6 inches was bad enough, but the real challenge was the ferocious wind that accompanied it, gusting to 50 miles per hour and sculpting the snow into monumental drifts that choked side streets and alleys. The city's fleet of plows performed heroically on the main arteries, but they simply could not keep up with the volume and the wind-wafted redistribution of snow. In communities like Lincoln Square, Bridgeport, and Rogers Park, residents found themselves utterly marooned. The familiar urban landscape vanished, replaced by smooth, intimidating white dunes that reached the tops of parked cars and buried front steps. For the elderly and those living alone, this isolation became dangerous. Delivery trucks couldn't get through, meaning prescriptions went unfilled and groceries ran low. The city's initial response was criticized as slow and uneven, with wealthier wards seemingly getting plowed out faster than others, leading to accusations of a two-tiered recovery effort that frayed the civic trust. The dig out that followed was a city-wide exercise in gritty determination. With official resources stretched beyond their limit, Chicagoans did what they have always done. They took matters into their own hands. The whine of snowblowers became the soundtrack of the week, and the clinking of shovels on concrete could be heard at all hours. Neighbors who may have never spoken before banded together in the freezing cold, taking turns clearing each other's driveways and digging out buried fire hydrants. They shared hot coffee and sandwiches, creating impromptu block parties amidst the mountains of snow. This communal effort, this stubborn refusal to be defeated, is the storm's enduring legacy in the city's memory. It wasn't the record-breaking depth that defined the blizzard of '99 for Chicagoans. It was the powerful reminder that their city's greatest strength isn't its famed infrastructure or its winter-hardened reputation, but the sheer, unbreakable will of its people to help each other when the chips are down. Just as Chicago was demonstrating the power of community in the face of record snow, the nation's capital was about to experience a winter onslaught so extreme it would require the invention of a new word to describe it. The winter of 2010 delivered a devastating 1-2 punch to the mid-Atlantic region, a pair of blizzards just days apart that would collectively be christened with a name straight out of a Hollywood disaster movie, Snowmageddon. The stage was set by a classic meteorological pattern known as a negative North Atlantic oscillation, which essentially acted like a locking mechanism in the atmosphere, allowing bitter Arctic air to pour down and stall over the eastern United States. When a powerful low-pressure system moved up the coast, it didn't just encounter this cold air, it feasted upon it, pulling in an immense amount of moisture from the Atlantic Ocean and converting it into a historic dump of snow. The first storm struck over the weekend of February 5th, and it was an immediate record breaker. For 36 hours, snow fell at a consistent rate of 1 to 2 inches per hour, a breathtaking pace that quickly overwhelmed every plow and Chinese letter the region had. The official measurement in Washington, D.C.'s Dulles Airport was 32.4 inches, shattering the previous record, but the storm was far from finished. Just 4 days later, as the region was still gasping from the first blow, a second storm of nearly equal fury arrived, dumping another 10 to 20 inches on top of the existing mountains of snow. The cumulative effect was simply staggering. Baltimore found itself buried under a 77-inch seasonal total, while Washington, D.C. was completely paralyzed under more than 5 feet of snow in some suburbs. The sheer weight of this accumulation proved too much for countless structures. The roof of the Smithsonian Institution's Historic Arts and Industries building partially collapsed, and arena roofs throughout Maryland and Virginia buckled under the strain. The most visible and humbling symbol of the storm's power was the complete shutdown of the federal government. For an unprecedented 4.5 consecutive weekdays, the offices, museums, and agencies of the world's most powerful nation were closed. The mighty machinery of Capitol Hill fell silent, a testament to the fact that no amount of political or military might can countermand the absolute authority of nature. This wasn't a simple delay. It was a full-stop closure that cost an estimated $100 million a day in lost productivity and wages, showcasing a profound economic vulnerability that few had ever considered. Beyond the federal core, the urban infrastructure of the entire corridor was exposed as critically fragile. Side streets in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore remained impassable for over a week, trapping residents and preventing emergency services from responding to calls. The colossal task of finding places to put the snow became a logistical nightmare, with cities resorting to melting it in specialized machines or hauling it away in a continuous convoy of dump trucks that operated around the clock. Yet from this paralysis emerged a cultural phenomenon. The term Snowmageddon, popularized by the media and embraced on social media, instantly entered the global lexicon as the go-to descriptor for a catastrophic winter event. It perfectly captured the apocalyptic feeling of the days, the erasure of familiar landmarks, the profound silence that fell over normally bustling cities, and the collective sense of being at the mercy of an overwhelming force. The word itself became a story, a perfect blend of humor and horror that resonated with everyone digging out from under their own driveways. While the mid-Atlantic was buried, the storm's impact was bizarrely selective, a fact that added to its legendary status. Just a few hundred miles to the north, New York City received a mere dusting, while to the south, the snow was measured in inches, not feet. This sharp gradient highlighted the incredibly precise and almost cruel nature of the atmospheric setup, making the event feel even more like a targeted event. Snowmageddon was more than a pair of storms. It was a cultural moment that humbled a powerful region, exposed the thin veneer of urban resilience, and gave the world a new word for the utter chaos that winter can unleash. But if Snowmageddon was a localized shutdown of the capital, the storm that began to brew in the final days of January 2011 was a true continental conqueror, a beast of a system that seemed intent on testing the entire nation's winter resolve at once. The Groundhog Day blizzard didn't just target a single region. It unleashed its fury along a 1,900-mile path from the high deserts of New Mexico all the way to the rocky coast of Maine. The atmospheric setup was a perfect, sprawling engine of destruction. A deep dip in the jet stream carved a trough over the central United States, allowing frigid Arctic air to spill far to the south. At the same time, a powerful area of low pressure developed over the Texas Panhandle and began to ride this frigid highway northeastward, drawing a fire hose of deep moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. This collision of extreme cold and abundant tropical moisture was a recipe for a historic snowfall, but the storm added its own terrifying special effects to the mix. One of the most dramatic and disorienting features of this blizzard was the widespread phenomenon of thundersnow. As the storm intensified, the rising air became so powerful and unstable that it began to generate lightning and thunder within the snow bands themselves. For those caught in it, the experience was surreal and deeply unsettling. The classic warning of an approaching thunderstorm, the darkening sky and rising wind, was completely absent, replaced by an already howling blizzard. Then, without warning, a flash of blue or purple light would illuminate the swirling snow, followed seconds later by a deep, muffled boom that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. This wasn't just a rare meteorological curiosity, it was a sign of exceptionally intense snowfall rates. In Chicago, where thundersnow was reported multiple times, snowfall rates reached an incredible 3 to 4 inches per hour, transforming the city into a roaring, electric whiteout where even familiar neighborhood landmarks vanished completely. The human experience of the storm was shaped by its ironic timing, arriving as it did on February 2nd. Across the country, communities that would typically be gathering in town squares for the quirky, light-hearted tradition of Groundhog Day were instead hunkering down behind boarded windows. The most famous celebration in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, went on as scheduled but with a drastically altered mood. The usual crowd of tens of thousands was reduced to a few hundred determined, or perhaps foolhardy, souls who braved the fierce winds and driving snow to hear Punxsutawney Phil's prediction. The rodent himself was presumably unimpressed, seeing his shadow and predicting 6 more weeks of a winter that was, at that very moment, demonstrating its absolute authority. For everyone else, the day became an enforced indoor holiday. Families celebrated not with outdoor festivities, but with improvised cabin fever parties, watching the historic weather unfold on television while the world outside their windows disappeared under a thickening blanket of white. The economic and logistical toll was immense and immediate. The storm's sheer geographic scope meant it disrupted commerce on a national scale. Every major airport from Oklahoma City to Boston Logan was shut down, canceling over 14,000 flights and stranding travelers for days. The ripple effects snarled air travel across the entire country and even into Europe and Asia. On the ground, the situation was even more dire. The massive north-south artery of Interstate 90 was closed for stretches across multiple states, while I-70 and I-80 became parking lots for thousands of stranded truckers, halting the delivery of everything from fresh produce to manufactured goods. The combination of heavy, wet snow and hurricane-force wind gusts proved too much for power grids already strained by the cold. Over 1 million customers from Oklahoma to New Jersey lost electricity, plunging homes into a dark and rapidly cooling silence during the coldest part of the year. Utility crews facing monumental drifts and blocked roads worked heroic shifts to restore power, but for many, the blackout lasted for days, turning a modern inconvenience into a primitive struggle for warmth. In the aftermath, as the continent began the arduous task of digging out, the Groundhog Day blizzard secured its place in the record books. It was the 3rd largest snowstorm for Chicago, which received 21.2 inches. It set new single-storm records in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Joplin, Missouri, proving that even states more accustomed to ice than snow were not immune to its power. But beyond the statistics, the storm left a different kind of legacy. It was a stark demonstration of how interconnected and vulnerable our modern systems remain. A storm in the heartland could halt flights in London, and a blizzard on the plains could prevent goods from reaching shelves in New England. It was a humbling reminder that for all our technology and infrastructure, a perfectly aligned atmosphere can still bring the mightiest elements of our society to a temporary but complete standstill, all on a day when a famous rodent was supposed to tell us how much winter we had left. As the new year of 2016 dawned, the weather models began to hint at something monumental brewing for the eastern seaboard. By the 3rd week of January, what had been a speculative forecast solidified into a prediction that seemed almost too extreme to believe. Meteorologists, their voices tinged with a mix of professional awe and genuine alarm, began using terms like potentially historic and life-threatening. The cause was a perfect and terrifying alignment. A massive high-pressure system off the coast of Greenland, known as a block, was acting like an atmospheric stop sign, preventing the normal eastward progression of weather systems. In front of it, a powerful low-pressure system was forecast to undergo bombogenesis, its central pressure dropping precipitously as it moved up the coast, pulling in a vast reservoir of ocean moisture and slamming it into a wall of cold Arctic air. The stage was set for a blizzard that will be remembered not just for its depth, but for its sheer, breathtaking scope. The storm, which would be dubbed by various media outlets as Winter Storm Jonas or simply the January 2016 blizzard, did not disappoint. It unleashed its fury over a 36-hour period from January 22nd to 23rd, and its statistics were staggering. The band of heaviest snow, a swath over 150 miles wide, painted a white stripe from the Appalachians to the Atlantic. Within this zone, snowfall rates consistently reached 2 to 3 inches per hour, with some reports of thundersnow adding an element of surreal drama to the event. When the last flake fell, the record books had been rewritten. Baltimore, Maryland received 29.2 inches, its largest snowfall ever recorded. Allentown, Pennsylvania measured 31.9 inches. New York City's Central Park saw 27.5 inches, cementing the storm as the second largest in the city's history, while areas of West Virginia and Pennsylvania were buried under more than 40 inches of snow. The weight of this accumulation was immense, collapsing roofs, snapping countless tree limbs, and leaving over 500,000 people without power at the height of the storm. But what truly set this blizzard apart from its historical predecessors was the era in which it occurred. For the first time in history, a major winter catastrophe was unfolding in the palm of everyone's hand, documented in real time not by news crews but by millions of ordinary citizens. This was the first full-blown social media blizzard. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram became a live, pulsating nerve center of the event. While official forecasts provided the skeleton of the storm's story, social media provided its beating heart, its raw emotion, and its collective consciousness. Hashtags like Snowmageddon and Jonas became virtual town squares where people shared updates, expressed anxiety, and offered support to virtual neighbors they had never met. The constant stream of photos and videos created a mosaic of the storm's impact that was far more immediate and visceral than any traditional news broadcast could ever achieve. The most powerful and enduring images to emerge were those of profound stillness and isolation. In a normally hyperactive 24/7 world, the storm imposed a mandatory pause, and social media captured it with eerie beauty. A photographer's time-lapse video of a completely empty Times Square, its massive digital billboards glowing over swirling snow instead of bustling crowds, went instantly viral, becoming the defining visual of the event. Similar scenes poured in from Washington, D.C.'s National Mall and Philadelphia's Benjamin Franklin Parkway, iconic public spaces, typically teeming with life, now rendered as silent, monochromatic landscapes. These images were hauntingly beautiful, but they also served a crucial practical purpose. They were the most effective public service announcements imaginable, visually screaming the message that travel was impossible and staying put was the only option. Beyond the empty plazas, citizen journalists documented the storm's sheer power with awe-inspiring footage. Drone technology, now accessible to consumers, provided a breathtaking new perspective. Stunning aerial videos showed entire suburban neighborhoods submerged under a smooth, unbroken white blanket, with only the peaks of roofs and the tips of street signs hinting at the civilization below. On the ground, users posted videos of themselves leaping from second-story windows into 15-foot drifts, or tunneling through the snow to reach a buried front door. These personal, first-hand accounts did more than just showcase the storm's magnitude. They fostered a powerful sense of shared experience and community resilience. They transformed a terrifying natural event into a collective adventure, a story that was being written collaboratively by everyone who was living through it. The January 2016 blizzard was a record-setting meteorological event, but its true legacy is its status as a digital age milestone. The moment a major winter storm became a shared, live-streamed phenomenon that connected millions in a virtual snow globe. While the Schoolhouse Blizzards' meteorological details are chilling, the true, gut-wrenching weight of the tragedy is found not in weather maps, but in the intimate, personal stories of those who were suddenly fighting for their lives on the open prairie. The storm's enduring nickname itself speaks to its core horror. This was a disaster that preyed upon the most vulnerable, striking at the precise moment thousands of children were dismissed from their one-room schoolhouses, sending them directly into the heart of the whiteout. The narratives of the teachers, often young women barely out of their teens themselves, form the emotional center of this catastrophe. Faced with an impossible choice, keep the children inside and risk freezing to death if the fuel ran out, or send them home and hope they could find their way, their decisions meant the difference between life and death. The most famous act of heroism belongs to Minnie Freeman, a teacher in Nebraska. As the wind tore the roof from her schoolhouse, she made a split-second decision. She took a clothesline rope, tied her students together in a long line, and led them on a blind, harrowing trek through the screaming blizzard to the safety of her boarding house nearly a mile away. Miraculously, she delivered every single child to safety, a feat of incredible leadership and courage that became legendary. But for every story of miraculous survival, there was one of heartbreaking loss. Lois Royce, another Nebraska teacher, attempted a similar rescue with 3 of her youngest students. They became disoriented just 200 yards from the schoolhouse, a distance that should have been an easy walk. Huddled together in a desperate attempt to stay warm, all 3 children perished in her arms. She was found later severely frostbitten and ultimately lost her feet to amputation, a physical manifestation of the trauma she endured. These contrasting fates highlight the razor's edge upon which survival balanced. A wrong turn, a moment of hesitation, or a single broken rope could seal a tragic fate. The storm's impact seeped deep into the cultural fabric of the American Midwest, transforming it from a weather event into a foundational story of hardship and resilience. It was immortalized in literature by writers like Willa Cather, who captured the brutal reality of pioneer life, and more recently, in David Laskin's meticulously researched book The Children's Blizzard, which painstakingly reconstructs the stories of the victims and survivors, giving names and voices back to those lost to the snow. The event is remembered in memorials across the plains. A simple, poignant monument stands near the site of a schoolhouse in Nebraska, listing the names of children who perished together. These acts of remembrance ensure that the 235 officially recorded deaths are not just a statistic, but a collection of individual tragedies that forever changed the communities they touched, serving as a permanent, sobering reminder of the prairie's unforgiving nature. While the great coastal blizzards captured headlines with their swift and violent fury, a different kind of winter nightmare was unfolding on the northern plains, a slow, grinding, relentless siege that tested the human spirit not for days but for months on end. The winter of 1880 to 81 in the Dakota Territory wasn't defined by a single storm, but by an unbroken succession of them, a season of such profound and unyielding severity that it would forever be seared into history as simply the hard winter. From October until the following April, the snows came one after another with barely a pause. There was no great thaw, no moment of reprieve. Each new storm simply added another layer to a deepening, continent-wide blanket of white that smothered the land, a frozen prison from which there seemed no escape. This was the world immortalized by Laura Ingalls Wilder in her beloved novel The Long Winter, a first-hand account of her family's struggle to survive in the town of De Smet. Her writing captures not the sudden shock of a blizzard, but the creeping, psychological dread of a siege. The snow began falling in October and never truly stopped, piling up until the drifts reached the eaves of single-story homes. The Ingalls family's claimed shanty, their small frontier home, was completely buried, with only the stovepipe poking out above the dunes to mark their presence in a vast white emptiness. The iconic image of that winter is not of a howling storm, but of the absolute silence that followed, a world where all familiar sound was absorbed by the snow, and the only signs of life were the desperate trails of smoke rising from buried chimneys. Ingenuity became the currency of survival. With the landscape erased, ordinary movement was impossible. Townspeople responded by transforming their world from the ground up, or rather from the snow down. They carved an entire network of tunnels connecting the essential buildings of De Smet, from the homes to the general store to the schoolhouse. These weren't just narrow paths, they were thoroughfares wide enough for two people to pass, with walls of packed snow taller than a man and ceilings hardened by the wind into a solid, arching crust. Life carried on in this strange, subterranean world. Children went to school through these icy corridors, and neighbors visited, but always with the unspoken fear that a new storm could collapse the entire labyrinth and seal them inside. The most terrifying enemy, however, wasn't the cold or the snow itself, but the slow, inexorable threat of starvation. The railroads, the only lifeline for bringing in food and fuel, were completely and utterly defeated. Snowplows sent to clear the tracks were themselves swallowed by drifts that reached 30, 40, even 50 feet high in the cuts between the prairies. Trains were abandoned where they stalled, entombed in ice, their precious cargo of coal and wheat inaccessible just miles from the desperate towns. With no incoming supplies, the settlers were thrown entirely on their own dwindling resources. The town's only two commodities, wheat and coal, were rationed with grim determination. Families ground their own wheat in a small coffee mill to make coarse, dark bread, their only sustenance for weeks on end. They learned to burn twisted hay for fuel, a poor substitute that gave off little heat but was all they had to keep the deadly cold at bay. The psychological toll of this isolation was immense. This was a battle fought not in hours but in months. Every day brought the same bleak view from a frost-encrusted window, the same struggle to find enough fuel to last the night, the same monotonous meal of bread and water. Hope itself became a scarce resource, dwindling with each failed attempt to get a train through. The story of two young men, Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland, who risked their lives to venture out onto the open prairie to find a rumored cache of wheat owned by a lone settler, became the stuff of local legend. Their successful, life-saving mission was a rare spark of triumph in a season defined by endurance. The hard winter finally broke in May, but its legacy was permanent. It had shown the settlers that the prairie's greatest power was not its summer storms, but its immense, silent capacity for patience, waiting to test them with a winter that would never end. Yet for all the brutal lessons of the hard winter, a new kind of cold catastrophe was already on the horizon, one that would prove that deep cold could be just as destructive as deep snow, and that its reach could extend far beyond the snowy plains to the sun-drenched groves of the south. The winter of 1894–95 delivered a one-two punch of almost supernatural severity, a prolonged deep freeze punctuated by a series of bizarre, snow-laden blizzards that swept deep into latitudes utterly unaccustomed to such phenomena. This wasn't a story of a single storm, but of a season-long grip of Arctic air that refused to loosen its hold, creating a crisis that would permanently reshape the map of American agriculture. The atmospheric setup for this disaster was a large-scale blocking pattern of almost unprecedented stability. A massive dome of high pressure became entrenched over eastern Canada and the northeastern United States, acting like a immovable rock in a stream, deflecting the normal west-to-east flow of the jet stream. This forced the polar jet to dive far to the south, funneling wave after wave of frigid, dense Arctic air directly into the heart of the nation, and crucially, allowing it to spill all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This pattern persisted for weeks, creating a baseline of cold that was itself destructive. But the real catastrophe arrived when potent low-pressure systems rode along this frigid highway. These storms did not bring moderating air. Instead, they pulled even more cold air southward in their wake, and as they tracked across the Gulf states, they pulled up Gulf moisture, unleashing freezing rain, sleet, and most surreal of all, significant snowfall in places that had never recorded a single flake. The visual contradiction was stunning. In New Orleans, a city known for its humid, subtropical heat, a 5-inch blanket of snow silenced the bustling streets, with icicles draping from the iron-lace balconies of the French Quarter. In Tallahassee, Florida, the state capital, 8 inches of snow fell, a depth that would be notable in Chicago, let alone the peninsula. But the snow was merely the picturesque and utterly deceptive face of the disaster. The real killer was the cold that accompanied and followed it. Temperatures plunged to levels that seemed plucked from a different continent. On December 29, 1894, the mercury in Tallahassee dropped to an incredible -2 degrees Fahrenheit, a state record that still stands today as the only sub-zero temperature ever recorded in Florida. Across Georgia and the Carolinas, readings between -5 and -20 were common. This wasn't a brief overnight dip. This was a sustained, days-long deep freeze that penetrated the earth itself, freezing the ground solid to a depth of several inches. For the citrus industry, which was then almost entirely concentrated in the northern and central regions of Florida, this was an extinction-level event. The methods growers used to try and save their trees read like a manual of desperation. They built small, smoldering fires called smudge pots throughout their groves, hoping the smoke would create an insulating blanket to trap what little warmth radiated from the ground. They tried spraying the trees with water, a technique that would become standard practice decades later, but here, without modern sprinkler systems, was haphazard and often counterproductive, as the water instantly froze on the branches, adding a heavy, breaking layer of ice to the deadly cold. They wrapped the delicate trunks of young trees in burlap and newspaper, a futile gesture against cold of such magnitude and duration. Nothing worked. The trees and the fruit hanging from them were literally frozen solid. The aftermath was a scene of absolute desolation. When the temperatures finally moderated, the scale of the destruction was revealed. The entire citrus crop was a total loss, the frozen oranges and lemons falling from the branches with a solid thud. Worse, the trees themselves were dead. The sap within their trunks had frozen, expanded, and burst the cells apart, a process called cavitation. The groves that had once been a lush, green symbol of Florida's potential were now a stark landscape of blackened, brittle wood. The financial ruin was total and immediate. For many growers, their trees represented their entire life savings and their only source of income. They were wiped out in a single night. The state's nascent citrus industry, which had been a point of immense pride and economic hope, was virtually erased from the map. This colossal failure became the catalyst for one of the most significant internal migrations in American agricultural history. Broken and bankrupt, a large contingent of these Florida growers made a monumental decision. They would start over, but they would do it in a place where such a catastrophe could never happen again. They looked to the west, to the sun-soaked valleys of Southern California. The climate there was not only perfect for citrus, with warm, sunny days and cool nights, but it was also reliably stable, protected by mountain ranges that blocked the kind of direct Arctic onslaught that had devastated Florida. This westward movement of knowledge, capital, and determined people supercharged California's own budding citrus industry. The expertise these migrant growers brought with them in cultivation, bud selection, and eventually in marketing was instrumental in building the iconic Sunkist Cooperative and establishing California's dominance in orange and lemon production, a title it holds to this day. The Great Freeze of 1894 was a tragedy of immense proportion for the South, but its legacy is etched into the very landscape of the West, a permanent reminder of how a single, brutal winter can reroute the currents of commerce and rewrite a nation's agricultural destiny. While the Great Plains and eastern cities were forging their legends of survival, the mighty Rocky Mountains were about to endure a winter assault that would test the very limits of human endurance in one of the most rugged landscapes on the continent. The blizzard of 1966 was a classic textbook Colorado low, a storm system that developed over the high deserts of the Southwest and began to intensify as it drew a massive plume of moisture north from the Pacific. But this was no ordinary low-pressure system. It parked itself over the central Rockies and refused to move for 3 paralyzing days from December 21st to 23rd, acting like a gigantic stationary snow machine aimed directly at the high peaks and passes of Colorado and Wyoming. The result was a snowfall of almost mythical proportions, a relentless pounding onslaught that would bury entire communities and redefine the very meaning of a mountain winter. The statistics from the storm are still spoken of with reverence and a touch of disbelief by old-timers in the region. The town of Buffalo Creek, Colorado, was utterly buried under 87 inches of snow, that is over 7 feet. The nearby community of Idaho Springs received 72 inches. Even the major metropolitan area of Denver was brought to a complete standstill under a depth of 23 inches, a record at the time that choked the city's fledgling snow removal capabilities. But these official measurements only told part of the story. The true character of the storm was defined by the ferocious wind that screamed down from the high peaks, gusting to 70 miles per hour. This wind took the deep, fresh powder and sculpted it into monstrous, shifting dunes. Drifts piled up to 20, 30, and even 40 feet high, completely erasing the landscape and swallowing single-story buildings whole. The most critical and deadly aspect of these drifts was their location. They completely obliterated every major transportation route through the mountains. This created a nightmare scenario on a scale rarely seen. All 3 of the vital east-west highways, Interstate 70, US 40, and US 287, vanished beneath the snow. The most dramatic and terrifying situation unfolded on a 14-mile stretch of US 40 over Berthoud Pass, a critical and notoriously steep mountain corridor. Here, hundreds of motorists became trapped in a massive, frozen traffic jam. Initially, people assumed they would be stuck for a few hours, but as the snow continued to fall with no sign of stopping, and the radio broadcasts began to take on a tone of grave concern, those hours stretched into a full day and then another. The situation transformed from an inconvenience into a life-or-death crisis. Families celebrating the beginning of the Christmas holiday season found themselves stranded in their cars, watching their fuel gauges drop as they desperately ran the engine for fleeting moments of heat, all the while knowing the deadly risk of carbon monoxide poisoning if their tailpipe became clogged by the rising snow. The response from the isolated mountain towns that dotted the highways was one of incredible, spontaneous heroism. In places like Georgetown, Silver Plume, and Empire, located precariously along the buried routes, the entire community mobilized. With official plows and rescue vehicles unable to penetrate the deepest drifts, locals took matters into their own hands using the only tools that could navigate such terrain: bulldozers, snowcats, and most famously, armies of snowshoes and cross-country skis. These ordinary citizens became emergency responders, donning their winter gear and setting out into the blinding storm to find the stranded. They skied from car to car along the buried highway, delivering life-saving supplies of hot soup, coffee, blankets, and gasoline siphoned from their own vehicles. They guided freezing, disoriented motorists back to their towns on foot, transforming community centers, church basements, and even private homes into impromptu shelters that were soon overflowing with grateful refugees from the storm. The most dramatic rescues, however, were carried out from the air. As the storm finally began to abate on December 24th, the National Guard and Air Force were able to launch helicopters on a daring mission to reach those still stranded in the most remote and inaccessible areas. The aerial views were staggering. The mountains looked like a smooth, white desert, with only the tops of telephone poles and the occasional roof peak hinting at the civilization below. Pilots navigated treacherous gusts to perform risky hoist operations, plucking people from the roofs of their buried cars and the deep snowbanks alongside the road. One of the most iconic images to emerge from the blizzard was that of a National Guard helicopter landing right on the snow-packed surface of Berthoud Pass, its rotors kicking up a blinding cloud of ice crystals as it loaded shivering survivors for the flight to safety. In total, over 1,000 people were rescued from the highways, a monumental effort that prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. The blizzard of '66 left a profound and lasting impact on the Rocky Mountain region. It exposed the critical vulnerability of its transportation infrastructure and served as a brutal wake-up call. In the years that followed, states invested heavily in new technologies and strategies for keeping the high mountain passes open. The fleet of snowplows was expanded and upgraded to include more powerful rotary plows capable of cutting through the deepest drifts. Avalanche control programs were significantly enhanced, with artillery and explosive experts deployed to proactively trigger slides before they could threaten the highways. Most importantly, the storm forged a deeper culture of preparedness and self-reliance in the Mountain West, a collective understanding that in the high country, community isn't just a word, it's the first and last line of defense when the skies open up and the world turns white. While the storm of the century was a record-breaking event for the entire eastern seaboard, its most surreal and disorienting impacts were felt not in the snow-hardened cities of the north, but across the American South. For residents of Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas, the forecast leading up to March 12, 1993, seemed less like a weather report and more like a work of fiction. Meteorologists were predicting not just a dusting, but a potential foot or more of heavy, accumulating snow. The public reaction ranged from dismissive disbelief to outright mockery. After all, many towns in these states hadn't seen a significant snowfall in decades, and the entire region's infrastructure and cultural mindset were built around heat and humidity, not ice and snow. The concept of a blizzard was simply an abstract idea from television or stories about faraway places. This widespread skepticism vanished in the early morning hours as the storm's leading edge arrived not with gentle flakes, but with a violent and disorienting phenomenon, thundersnow. The eerie experience of lightning flashing through a heavy, wind-driven snow was many Southerners' first indication that this was no ordinary weather event. The snow began to fall at an unbelievable rate, quickly coating the iconic Spanish moss hanging from live oaks and the delicate blossoms of early blooming dogwood trees in a thick, heavy layer of white. The juxtaposition was bizarre and almost beautiful, a classic southern landscape instantly transformed into a monochromatic winter postcard. This initial wonder, however, quickly gave way to genuine alarm as the accumulations continued to climb past 6, then 12, and in some places over 20 inches. The paralysis was instantaneous and far more complete than in any northern city. Southern municipalities owned only a handful of snowplows, if they owned any at all. Salt and sand supplies were meager and quickly exhausted. This meant that once the snow stopped, it was there to stay. Every single highway and secondary road became a smooth, unplowed ribbon of packed ice and snow. The most iconic and humbling images of the storm's southern campaign were the photographs of interstate highways like I-20 and I-85, which are typically roaring with traffic, now completely silent and buried under 2 feet of snow, with only the tops of guardrails visible to mark their path. The region was frozen in place, but the true crisis unfolded on a much more personal level, behind the doors of homes never designed for a single degree of frost. Architecturally, the South is built to shed heat, not retain it. Homes feature lightly insulated walls, large single-pane windows, and most critically, plumbing that is often routed through unheated crawl spaces or even along exterior walls. As the deep cold set in behind the snow, this design became a critical vulnerability. Water pipes froze and then burst by the tens of thousands, unleashing torrents of water into homes where the occupants had no power to stop it. With plumbers overwhelmed and impossible to reach, families resorted to desperate measures, turning off their main water valves and melting snow on gas stoves for those who still had gas for drinking and cooking water. The deep snow also trapped many people in their own homes, particularly the elderly in rural areas, who had no way to call for help and no means to dig themselves out. The storm's impact on the South was a profound lesson in regional vulnerability. It exposed a dire lack of winter emergency protocols and a populace that was completely unequipped, both physically and psychologically, for such an event. In the years that followed, many city and county governments across the region established small but critical stockpiles of salt and sand and contracted with private heavy equipment operators to be on call for snow removal. More importantly, the storm of the century left a deep psychological imprint. It shattered the assumption that severe winter weather was someone else's problem, teaching a generation of Southerners that even in the heart of Dixie, nature could deliver a knockout punch of ice and snow that would humble the most confident among them. And just as the South was confronting its unexpected vulnerability to snow, a storm was taking shape that would test the preparedness of the very region thought to be most ready for it. The blizzard of 2003, often overshadowed by the more famous superstorms, was a sharp, brutal reminder to the Northeast that winter requires constant vigilance. This storm didn't have the slow, dramatic buildup of a classic nor'easter. Instead, it seemed to intensify almost in the blink of an eye. A seemingly modest low-pressure system off the Carolinas underwent a process of rapid cyclogenesis, its central pressure plummeting as it raced northward parallel to the coast. This explosive strengthening caught some forecasters slightly off guard, transforming a predicted significant snowfall into a full-blown blizzard warning in a matter of hours. For the densely populated corridor from the nation's capital to the heart of New England, the race was on, but the storm was already winning. The snow began in earnest on President's Day weekend, February 16th, and it fell with a relentless, pounding consistency that broke records with quiet efficiency. Baltimore was smothered under 28.2 inches, its second largest snowfall on record. Philadelphia received 21.3 inches, bringing the city to a complete standstill. Further north, Boston saw over 27 inches, while parts of Connecticut and Massachusetts were buried under 3 feet of snow. But the sheer depth was only part of the story. The storm's true character was defined by its fierce winds, which gusted between 45 and 60 miles per hour. These winds didn't just drift the snow, they created a continuous, ground-level blizzard that reduced visibility to zero and made the simple act of seeing across the street an impossibility. This combination of immense accumulation and hurricane-force winds created a scenario where even seasoned snow removal crews found themselves overwhelmed. Their plows often stuck behind colossal drifts that had to be broken apart by front-end loaders before the streets could even be cleared. In the heart of this white chaos, the most critical battle was waged not by plows, but by the region's emergency services. The blizzard struck on a holiday weekend, meaning more people were at home, but it also created a perfect storm of medical emergencies. The physical strain of shoveling the incredibly heavy, wet snow triggered a tragic spike in heart attacks across the region, with emergency call volumes skyrocketing to levels never before seen. The most daunting challenge, however, was simply reaching those in need. Ambulances and fire trucks, even those with four-wheel drive, were instantly immobilized by the deep, unplowed snow. This forced first responders to adopt tactics more akin to a war zone than a modern American city. Police and fire departments partnered with volunteers who owned snowmobiles and large four-wheel drive vehicles, creating impromptu rescue convoys to answer the most desperate calls. The stories of heroism that emerged from that weekend are a testament to human resilience. Paramedics in New York City, unable to get their ambulance down a buried side street, shouldered their gear and trudged on foot through chest-deep snow for 6 blocks to reach a man suffering a cardiac arrest, saving his life. In a suburban Massachusetts town, a team of firefighters used a sled to transport a woman in active labor to a waiting national Humvee that could navigate the main road, delivering her safely to the hospital just in time. Perhaps the most widespread effort was undertaken by teams of neighbors and community volunteers who took it upon themselves to check on the elderly and disabled, delivering prescriptions, food, and firewood, ensuring that those most vulnerable were not forgotten in the frozen isolation. The blizzard of 2003 didn't just drop record snowfall. It revealed the incredible depth of community spirit that emerges when the systems we rely on fail, proving that the most essential emergency service is often the kindness of the person next door. For a city famous for its dramatic weather changes, the forecast that began to circulate on December 23, 1982, seemed almost too extreme to be believed. Denver, Colorado, nestled at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, is no stranger to snow, but what was being predicted was something else entirely. Meteorologists saw the perfect ingredients coming together. A deep, slow-moving low-pressure system from the southwest was set to collide with a vast reservoir of Arctic air, creating a funnel for immense moisture to be dumped directly over the city. The warnings were urgent, but for many Denver residents busy with last-minute Christmas Eve preparations, the idea of a storm halting their holiday plans felt like an unlikely disruption. This confidence would vanish in a matter of hours, replaced by the stark reality of one of the most intense single-day snowfalls any major American city had ever witnessed. The storm's arrival on Christmas Eve was not gentle. It began in the morning with a light, almost pleasant snow, but by midday it had transformed into a furious, blinding onslaught. The snow didn't just fall, it seemed to explode from the sky, driven by winds that gusted to 40 miles per hour. The rate of accumulation was simply breathtaking, consistently reaching 2 to 3 inches per hour for an uninterrupted 20-hour period. The city's infrastructure, designed for typical front-range snowstorms, was completely and instantly overwhelmed. Plows were pulled from the streets as visibility dropped to zero, their drivers unable to see the curbs they were meant to clear. By nightfall on that most silent of nights, the mile-high city was buried under a blanket of white that measured 31.8 inches at Stapleton International Airport, with some suburban areas reporting drifts over 10 feet high. The weight of this snow, heavy and dense, snapped power lines and tree limbs, plunging over 100,000 homes into a dark, cold silence on Christmas Eve. With the city officially shut down and emergency services stretched beyond their limits, Denver residents were thrown into a state of profound isolation. The most iconic and surreal images from the blizzard were not of stranded cars, but of completely buried homes. In neighborhoods across the city, the snow drifted so high that it covered first-floor windows and doors, effectively sealing people inside their own houses. This entrapment sparked a wave of incredible ingenuity and community spirit that defined the storm's legacy. With no way to get out through their doors, people began to dig. But they didn't just dig out, they dug in. Families, particularly those with children, took to carving elaborate networks of tunnels and snow caves from their front doors out into the yards and streets. These weren't just simple paths, they were arched corridors complete with rooms and connecting passageways to neighbors' homes, transforming entire blocks into a temporary subterranean village. Children, of course, saw it as the ultimate Christmas adventure, a magical world of white, while adults recognized it as a necessary and strangely beautiful means of survival and connection. This spontaneous tunneling was just one part of a massive, city-wide effort of neighbors helping neighbors. The true character of Denver revealed itself not in the chaos of the storm, but in the quiet resolve that followed. With official help unable to reach them, people took matters into their own hands. Those with four-wheel drive vehicles and snowmobiles became impromptu couriers and ambulances, delivering prescription medicines to the elderly, checking on isolated families, and even transporting nurses to hospitals. On countless streets, the only sounds were the scraping of shovels and the hum of snowblowers as people dug out not only their own driveways but those of everyone on their block. The shared struggle erased the usual barriers between strangers, fostering a powerful sense of community that many residents recall as the storm's most enduring memory, a Christmas gift of human kindness delivered in the midst of a paralyzing disaster. The monumental challenge of digging out a major metropolitan area from under such a massive snowfall exposed critical flaws in the city's snow removal capabilities. The existing fleet of plows and heavy equipment was simply insufficient for an event of this scale. The most frustrating problem was one of simple physics. Where do you put over 75 million tons of snow? Pushing it to the sides of the road only created massive berms that buried cars and blocked intersections, making the problem worse. In the storm's aftermath, city engineers were forced to think differently. The Denver blizzard of '82 became the direct catalyst for a technological revolution in urban snow management. The city invested heavily in new, more powerful equipment, including high-capacity snow melters, massive machines that could ingest thousands of tons of snow per hour, melt it with heated water, and pump the resulting water into the sewer system. This technology meant that snow could be removed from critical areas like hospital entrances and major intersections without needing vast empty lots for storage. The storm's painful lessons also led to the development of more sophisticated coordination plans, integrating weather forecasting with a phased response system to better prioritize resources. While no city can ever be fully prepared for a 3-foot snowfall, Denver's experience forged a new standard for winter resilience, turning a Christmas catastrophe into a masterclass in municipal adaptation. But while Denver's Christmas Eve blizzard was a test of municipal response, the city of Buffalo, New York, was about to face a tempest of such bizarre intensity and localized fury that it would defy all modern forecasting and redefine the very limits of lake effect snow. The week of November 17, 2014, began with a forecast that, for western New York, was almost routine. A shot of cold air moving over the still warm waters of Lake Erie would likely trigger some significant lake effect snow bands. But the atmosphere had a nightmare in store that was anything but routine. The key to the catastrophe was a phenomenon known as an omega block, a high-pressure system that became locked in place over eastern Canada. This block acted like an immovable atmospheric traffic cop, forcing the jet stream to bend around it in a massive, wavy pattern. Directly south of this block, a deep trough of low pressure became stuck, creating a powerful, unwavering funnel that pulled a continuous stream of Arctic air directly over the entire 241-mile length of Lake Erie. This setup was a perfect, sustained engine for the most extreme lake effect snow imaginable. The air was bitterly cold, the lake was still unusually warm for November, and the wind direction was almost perfectly aligned, a long fetch directly down the lake's axis. This allowed the air to maximize its moisture pickup, creating a single, terrifyingly efficient snow machine. The result wasn't a widespread storm, but a stationary band of snow so intense and focused it acted like a white laser beam pointed directly at the South Buffalo and West Seneca suburbs. For over 3 relentless days, this band barely wobbled, dumping snow at rates that seemed to defy physics. Official measurements became almost meaningless as the snow accumulated not in inches but in feet per hour. The town of Cheektowaga recorded 65 inches, Orchard Park was buried under 71 inches, and in the hardest hit areas the final total surpassed an almost incomprehensible 7 feet of snow. This was not a gentle powder, it was a heavy, concrete-like substance that fell with a suffocating weight, piling higher and higher with no end in sight. The immediate consequences were both surreal and horrifying. The sheer weight of the accumulation caused widespread roof collapses. Dozens of commercial buildings, from bowling alleys to gas stations, buckled under the strain. But most terrifyingly, so did homes. The sound of a roof groaning and cracking under the pressure became a pervasive fear for thousands of families trapped inside. With roads completely obliterated, traditional emergency response was impossible. Fire trucks and ambulances were utterly useless, entombed in their own stations or hopelessly stuck just feet from the bay doors. People were trapped in their houses, in their cars, and in businesses, with no way out and no certainty that help could ever reach them. The situation evolved from a severe weather event into a full-scale humanitarian crisis in a matter of hours, with thousands of people isolated and facing the threat of hypothermia, without power, or needing critical medical attention that couldn't be delivered. In this vacuum of official capacity, the community's response became the defining story of the storm, and it was orchestrated almost entirely through a new digital town square, social media. Hashtags like Snowvember and Buffalo Snow became lifelines. The city's residents, armed with smartphones and generators, performed a miraculous, self-organizing rescue operation. People tweeted their addresses and specific needs: insulin for a diabetic, formula for a baby, a rescue for an elderly relative, and within minutes, complete strangers would respond. Those with large, military-grade snowcats and modified tractors emerged as unlikely heroes, using Google Maps and Twitter direct messages to coordinate impromptu rescue convoys. They navigated the frozen canyons that were once streets, following the digital breadcrumbs of distress calls to deliver medicine, food, and even transport nurses to hospitals. Perhaps the most powerful tool to emerge was a simple, crowdsourced Google map. Someone had the idea to create an online map where people could pin their location and list their specific need or the resource they could offer. One pin might read, "Stranded with 3 children out of milk and bread." Another, just a few blocks away, would respond, "I have extra, my son is on a snowmobile and can bring it." This real-time, interactive resource map allowed a decentralized army of volunteers to operate with stunning efficiency, ensuring help went where it was most urgently needed. The Buffalo Snowvember storm was a tragedy of immense proportion, but it was also a landmark moment in disaster response. It demonstrated with breathtaking clarity that in the 21st century, a community's greatest resource in a crisis isn't just its heavy equipment, but its interconnectedness, its compassion, and its ability to organize itself when the world outside turns white and the traditional systems fail. From the paralyzing surprise of the Schoolhouse blizzard to the digital age siege of Snowvember, these 29 events paint a portrait of American winter that is far more complex and bizarre than any simple forecast could ever capture. We've journeyed through storms that painted palm trees white in Florida, that buried entire trains on the Great Plains, and that forced farmers to carry newborn calves into their living rooms to save them from the cold. Each of these events is a powerful reminder that nature operates on a scale that can both humble our greatest cities and inspire our most profound acts of courage and community. They are not merely weather reports from the past, they are pivotal moments that have literally reshaped our landscape, forged our laws, and tested the very fiber of our national character. These blizzards have been brutal teachers, but their lessons have been invaluable. They exposed the fatal flaw in a building's design, leading to stricter codes that have saved countless lives. They revealed the critical importance of communication, spurring the creation of the blizzard warning itself, and eventually the sophisticated forecasting that gives us days to prepare. They showed us the vulnerability of our interconnected systems, from the power grid to the national supply chain, forcing engineers and planners to build back stronger and more resilient. The story of American winter preparedness is written in the aftermath of these great storms, a legacy of innovation carved from deep snow and howling wind. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, however, is not found in infrastructure or technology, but in the shared stories passed down through generations. The tale of a teacher tying her students together with a rope, the memory of a city tunneling through drifts to reach their neighbors, the image of a Halloween trick or treater on snowshoes. these are the threads that weave the fabric of our collective experience. They remind us that our relationship with the elements is deeply personal, a dance between human resolve and natural force. So now we want to hear from you. What's your great blizzard story? Did you live through one of these historic events, or does your town have its own legendary snowstorm that defined a generation? Share your memories in the comments below, and if you're fascinated by the raw power of weather, let us know what other extreme events you'd like to see us explore next. From hurricanes to heat waves, the atmosphere always has another incredible story to tell.